At the inheritance meeting after my wife's funeral, my son-in-law smiled and told me the family business was finally his. He had no idea my wife had left me one final secret weapon. He thought he was attending a coronation, but when my lawyer walked in and read the results of a secret DNA test out loud, my son-in-law's world came crashing down. Before I tell you how a truth buried for 50 years became my ultimate revenge, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And hit that like and subscribe button if you believe that a legacy is built with integrity, not just blood. My name is Elias Vance, and I am 75 years old. The man I am today, the man sitting at the head of this long, polished mahogany table, is a stranger to myself. For 50 years, I was a creator. My hands, now spotted with age but still strong, knew the language of wood. I could feel the story in a piece of raw timber, the potential in its grain. I built furniture that was more than just furniture. It was art, it was a legacy. Vance Designs was not just a company. It was the house my wife Simone and I had built together, a house built on a foundation of quality, integrity, and a shared passion for beautiful, honest things. Now Simone was gone, and I was sitting in the company's boardroom, a cold, sterile space that her business-minded successor had designed, a room that felt more like a mausoleum than a place of creation. The air was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with grief. My daughter Lena sat on one side of the table, her face a pale, anxious mask. She was trapped, a sad, silent referee in a war she did not have the strength to stop. And across from me in the chair that had once been Simone's sat her husband, my son-in-law, Gregory Ross. Greg was the CEO of Vance Designs, a title I had reluctantly bestowed upon him 5 years ago at Simone's urging. He was a man with a sharp suit, a sharp smile, and a soul made of spreadsheets. He saw my life's work not as a legacy of craft, but as an underperforming brand, a collection of assets to be leveraged. The silence in the room was not one of respectful mourning for the woman who had co-founded this company. It was the silence of a hostile takeover, the quiet, expectant pause before the new king declares his reign. I looked at my daughter's husband, and I felt a grief that was separate from the vast, aching emptiness of losing my wife. I was grieving the loss of my company, which had been dying a slow death under his command for years. I was grieving the loss of my daughter, who had slowly been absorbed into his world of ambition and status. And I was grieving the loss of the 50 years of peace that had been shattered by this man's insatiable, rapacious hunger for more. He let the silence hang for a theatrically appropriate amount of time before he cleared his throat. He did not offer a word of comfort, not a single shared memory of the woman who had given him his career, his wife, his life. He was all business. "All right." He began, his voice a smooth, confident purr that made my skin crawl. "I know this is a difficult time for all of us." Simone was a force, but she would have been the first to say that the business must continue. We have a duty to her legacy and to the shareholders to look to the future. He slid a glossy folder across the polished table toward me. It landed with a soft, final thud. "This is the 5-year plan I've been developing," he said, his eyes gleaming with a predatory excitement he could no longer conceal. "Now that we are free from Simone's more traditionalist viewpoints, we can finally modernize. Scale up. We're talking a new, more affordable product line. Vance Essentials. We license the name, outsource the manufacturing to Asia. We can have our products in every big box store in the country within 2 years. We franchise the Vance Designs name for high-end interior designers. The potential for growth is astronomical." I didn't open the folder, I just looked at him. He was talking about taking my name, our name, a name that was synonymous with handcrafted quality and timeless design, and stamping it onto cheap, mass-produced garbage. He was talking about turning my life's work into a brand, a hollow logo to be sold to the highest bidder. It was a desecration. Lena looked down at her hands, her silence a quiet, painful act of complicity. I remained silent. My silence was a vacuum, and he filled it with his own arrogance. He saw my lack of response not as disapproval, but as the dazed, weary acceptance of a defeated old man. He believed my grief had rendered me powerless. He believed the fight had gone out of me when Simone's heart had stopped beating. And now he was moving in for the kill. The silence in the boardroom was a cold, heavy thing, a silence that had nothing to do with respectful mourning for the woman who had co-founded this company. It was the silence of a hostile takeover, the quiet, expectant pause before the new king declares his reign. I looked at my daughter's husband Gregory, sitting in the chair that had once been Simone's, and I felt a grief that was entirely separate from the vast, aching emptiness of losing my wife. I was grieving the loss of my company, which had been dying a slow death under his command for years. I was grieving the loss of my daughter Lena, who sat beside him, a pale, silent accomplice to the desecration that was about to unfold. Greg let the silence hang for a theatrically appropriate amount of time before he cleared his throat, a sharp, impatient sound that officially ended the period of mourning and began the age of commerce. He did not offer a word of comfort, not a single shared memory of Simone. He was all business. "All right," he began, his voice a smooth, confident purr that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "I know this is a difficult time for all of us. Simone was a force, a true visionary." He gave a small, respectful nod, a perfectly calibrated gesture of deference that meant nothing, but she would have been the first to say that the business must continue. "We have a duty to her legacy and to our shareholders to look to the future with a clear and unsentimental eye." Unsentimental. That was the word he chose to describe the future of a company that had been built on nothing but sentiment, on a pure, unadulterated love for the craft of woodworking. He slid a glossy black folder across the polished mahogany table toward me. It landed with a soft final thud, a stark modern object on the traditional wood I had chosen for this room 20 years ago. "This," he said, his eyes gleaming with a predatory excitement he could no longer conceal, "is the 5-year plan I've been developing. A roadmap to finally unlock the full potential of the Vance Designs brand." I didn't open the folder. I didn't have to. I just looked at him. My silence an invitation for him to continue to lay out the full, ugly scope of his vision. "Eli," he said, using my first name with a familiarity that was both disrespectful and patronizing. "You are a master craftsman, a legend, and Simone was the heart of this company. But the market has changed. We can't survive on sentiment and a handful of bespoke 6-figure commissions for wealthy collectors. That's not a business, it's a hobby. It's inefficient, it's unscalable, it's old-fashioned." Every word was a small, sharp blade methodically cutting away at the foundations of my life's work. He was framing my passion as a flaw, my commitment to quality as a weakness. "The Vance name," he continued, his voice rising with the passion of a true believer, "is a powerful brand. It means quality, luxury, heritage. But we have been leveraging that brand at only 1% of its potential. It's time to change that. It's time to modernize." He began to lay out his plan, a vision so antithetical to everything Simone and I had ever stood for that it felt like a physical violation. He spoke of a new, more affordable product line, Vance Essentials, he called it. The name alone was an insult. He spoke of outsourcing the manufacturing to our partners in Asia to dramatically reduce production costs. He was talking about taking my designs I had spent a lifetime perfecting and having them mass-produced in a factory on the other side of the world by people who had never felt the soul of a piece of wood. As he spoke of synergy and growth hacking, my mind drifted. I thought of the wood itself, the long, slow process of selecting the perfect piece of timber. I thought of the years I had spent learning the language of the grain, the way a piece of walnut wants to be shaped, the secrets a slab of cherry holds within it. Craftsmanship is a conversation between a man and his materials. It is a relationship built on respect and understanding. Greg was not talking about a conversation. He was talking about a monologue, a shouted command where the only thing that mattered was the final price tag. He went on, his excitement growing. He spoke of franchising the Vance Designs name, of licensing it to high-end interior designers across the country, allowing them to sell Vance-approved pieces. He was talking about turning my name, our name, a name that was my personal guarantee of quality, a promise I had made to every client for 50 years, and turning it into a sticker, a commodity, a hollow logo to be sold to the highest bidder. I looked at my daughter, Lena. She was staring down at her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. She would not meet my eyes. She had heard all of this before. She had, in her silence, already agreed to it. The daughter I had taught to appreciate the beauty of a hand-cut dovetail joint was now a silent partner in a plan to replace it with glue and staples. "The potential for growth is astronomical," Eli Gregg said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as if he were letting me in on a wonderful secret. "We can disrupt the entire high-end furniture market. We can have Vance Essentials in every big-box store in the country within 2 years. The name alone will sell. People will pay for the brand, for the story, even if the product is more accessible. More accessible, that's what he called it. Cheap, soulless, a lie. He was talking about taking the story of my life, the story of my love for my wife and my craft, and using it to sell a lie to the world. He finally finished his presentation. He leaned back in his chair, a smug, satisfied smile on his face. He had laid out his grand, brilliant vision. He had shown me the glorious, profitable future he had planned. And now he was looking at me, the old traditionalist, sentimental fool, with an expectant, almost pitying expression. He was waiting for my approval. He was waiting for me to recognize his genius, to be grateful for his vision, to hand over the keys to the kingdom I had built, so that he could begin the holy, righteous work of tearing it all down. He finished his presentation, the final glossy page of his 5-year plan lying on the table between us like a tombstone. He leaned back in his chair, the chair that had once been Simone's, and a smug, satisfied smile spread across his face. He had laid out his grand, brilliant vision. He had shown me the glorious, profitable future he had planned for my company, for my name. And now he was looking at me, the old traditionalist, sentimental fool, with an expectant, almost pitying expression. He was waiting for my approval. He was waiting for me to recognize his genius, to be grateful for his vision, to hand over the keys to the kingdom I had built, so that he could begin the holy, righteous work of tearing it all down. And I said nothing. I just sat there at the head of the table in the profound, heavy silence of the room. My silence was a vacuum, and he, in his arrogance, rushed to fill it with his own interpretations. I could see it in his eyes. He saw my silence not as a sign of strength or disapproval, but as the dazed, weary confusion of a grieving, defeated old man. He saw a mind that was no longer sharp enough to keep up, a will that was no longer strong enough to fight. He saw a relic, an obstacle that was about to be brushed aside. "Eli," he prompted, his voice gentle, patronizing, "did you hear me? This is the future. This is how we take this company to the next level, into the 21st century. It's a brilliant plan." I remained silent. My gaze was not on him, but on a spot on the far wall, a spot where a beautiful hand-carved clock I had made for Simone used to hang before he had it replaced with a soulless, minimalist piece of art. His patience, a commodity he had in very short supply, began to fray. I saw his smile tighten. He stood up and began to pace the room, his expensive shoes making sharp, aggressive sounds on the polished floor. He was a predator, growing impatient with its prey's refusal to simply lie down and die. "Look," he said, his voice losing its gentle edge, becoming sharper, harder. "I know this is a lot to take in. You're from a different generation. You think about things differently. You think about craft, about spending 6 months on a single perfect chair. I respect that. I really do. But it's not a business model. It's a hobby. And this company is no longer a hobby, Eli. It's a multi-million-dollar corporation, and it needs to be run like one." He stopped pacing and stood directly in front of me, his hands on his hips, his posture a declaration of dominance. He glanced at his wife, my daughter Lena. She was still staring down at her hands, a pale, silent statue. Her silence was all the permission he needed. He was in complete control of this room, of this company, of this family. Or so he believed. "Let's be honest here," he began, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone, a voice that was meant to sound like a man sharing a hard but necessary truth. "You and Simone had a good run. A great run. You built a nice little company, a respectable name. But it's over. That era is over. The future is not about spending a lifetime perfecting a single type of dovetail joint. It's about volume. It's about scale. It's about profit. It's about leveraging the brand name you created to build a real empire." He leaned down, placing his hands on the table, his face just a few feet from mine. The mask of the respectful son-in-law was gone completely now, replaced by the cold, hard face of his true ambition. "Simone was the one holding us back," he said, his voice a venomous whisper. "Her sentimentality, her obsession with tradition. She was an anchor on this company's potential." And then he delivered the blow, the words that would echo in my soul forever. "Now that the old woman is gone, things are going to change. Drastically." The phrase "the old woman" was a deliberate desecration. He was speaking of my wife, the love of my life, the woman whose vision and heart had been the true foundation of this company, as if she were a piece of outdated machinery that had finally been removed. I felt a surge of pure cold rage, a rage so intense it felt like ice in my veins. But on the outside, I remained perfectly still, my face a placid, unreadable mask. He saw my stillness, and he mistook it for surrender. He believed he had finally broken me, and now he went in for the kill. "We're not asking for your permission anymore, Eli," he said. his voice a cold, flat declaration of terms. "We're telling you how it's going to be. You will go to the lawyers tomorrow. You will sign the necessary papers to transfer your controlling shares of Vance Designs to Lena, making her the sole owner. This is her birthright after all." He said the word birthright with a sneer, as if it were a technicality he had to acknowledge before seizing what was rightfully his. And then he continued, straightening up, a look of final dismissive pity on his face. "You will retire. For good. You will clean out your workshop. You can take your personal tools, of course. But the company, the brand, the future, it's ours now. You can fend for yourself with whatever savings you have. It's time for the old guard to step aside and let the new vision take over." He had done it. He had laid out his terms. It was an unconditional surrender. He expected me to argue, to plead, to break down in a fit of impotent elderly rage. He stood there, triumphant, the conqueror, waiting for the final satisfying collapse of the old king. He had been pressing down on the coiled spring of my silence harder and harder, with no idea of the power that was stored within it. And now he had pressed it to its absolute limit. The battle was not coming. It had arrived. He had finished. His final brutal demand hung in the air of the cold boardroom, a testament to his own arrogance and my perceived weakness. He stood there, triumphant, the conqueror, waiting for the final satisfying collapse of the old king. He expected me to argue, to plead, to break down in a fit of impotent elderly rage. He had been pressing down on the coiled spring of my silence harder and harder, with no idea of the power that was stored within it. And now he had pressed it to its absolute limit. The silence that followed was profound. It was a silence so heavy, so complete, that the low hum of the building's air conditioning sounded like a roaring engine. In that silence, I felt my grief for Simone transform. The soft, aching sorrow was still there, but it was now encased in something new. A hard, cold, and beautifully clear shell of pure, unadulterated rage. Not a hot rage that makes a man shout. A cold rage, the kind that makes a man's mind perfectly dangerously calm. He had not just insulted me. He had not just tried to steal my life's work. He had desecrated the memory of my wife. "Now that the old woman is gone," he had said. He had spoken of the love of my life, the queen of my world, as if she were a piece of old, inconvenient furniture that had finally been hauled to the dump. And in that moment, he had forfeited any right to my mercy, to my pity, to my name. Slowly, deliberately, I lifted my head. I looked past his triumphant, sneering face and met the eyes of my daughter Lena. She would not hold my gaze. She looked down at the polished table, her face a pale, miserable mask of complicity. She had made her choice, and I in that moment made mine. I turned my eyes back to her husband, and I smiled. It was not a warm smile, it was not a happy smile. It was the slow, quiet, knowing smile of a master craftsman who sees the fatal, invisible flaw in a piece of wood just before the fool takes a hammer to it. It was the serene, detached expression of a general who watches the enemy's army march confidently into a perfectly laid ambush. It held a universe of sadness for the man he had forced me to become, and a chilling, beautiful certainty of the justice that was about to be unleashed. The confusion on his face was immediate. It was a fascinating thing to watch. The smug, victorious expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, then a wave of pure, baffled irritation. My reaction was not in his script. It was a variable he had not accounted for. What he asked, the single word sharp with annoyance. "What's so funny?" "Did you not hear me?" I said. "It's over." I didn't answer. I just continued to look at him, my smile unchanging. I saw the arrogant confidence in his posture begin to crumble, replaced by a defensive, aggressive stance. "Are you even listening to me, old man?" he snapped, his voice rising, the thin veneer of respect gone completely now. "This isn't a joke. I have just laid out the future of this company. Your company. My company now. And you're just going to sit there and grin like a fool." I continued to sit in silence, my stillness a stark contrast to his growing agitation. I was the rock, and he was the frantic, useless wave crashing against it. The power dynamic in the room was shifting, and he could feel it, but he could not understand it. A creeping sense of dread began to crawl into his eyes. This was wrong. This wasn't how the victim was supposed to act. A predator knows when its prey is not afraid, and it is the most terrifying discovery in its world. Just as he was about to speak again to escalate his threats, there was a sharp, authoritative knock on the boardroom door. The sound was so unexpected, so out of place in this private execution, that it made all three of us jump. Greg whirled around his face, a mask of pure fury at the interruption. "Who the hell is that?" he snarled. I told them we were not to be disturbed. Before he could say another word, the door opened. A man I had never seen before stepped inside. He was in his late 60s, impeccably dressed in a dark conservative suit with a full head of silver hair and a calm, commanding presence. He held a worn leather briefcase in one hand. He did not look like an employee. He looked like the man who owned the building. He completely ignored Greg and Lena. His eyes, which were as sharp and intelligent as a hawk's, found mine across the length of the long table. He gave me a small, respectful nod. "Elias?" he said, his voice a calm, rich baritone. "I apologize for the interruption. My flight was slightly delayed. I trust I'm not too late." The simple act, the simple words completely upended the reality of the room. The lawyer's easy familiarity with me, his calm assumption that he was expected, his complete and utter dismissal of Greg. It was a devastating shift in power. Greg was no longer the king in his throne room. He was an angry, confused obstacle in a conversation he was not a part of. "Who are you?" Greg demanded, his voice a mixture of outrage and confusion. "This is a private family meeting." The lawyer, Mr. Franklin, finally turned his gaze on Greg. He did not look angry. He did not look intimidated. He looked at my son-in-law with a cool clinical curiosity, the way a doctor might look at an interesting but unpleasant specimen under a microscope. "My name is Arthur Franklin," the lawyer said, his voice quiet, but carrying an immense weight. "And this is not a family meeting, Mr. Ross. This is a legal proceeding. I am here at the explicit posthumous instruction of my client." He paused, letting his final words land with the force of a physical blow. "My client, Mrs. Simone Vance." The mention of my wife's name, spoken with such authority by this stranger, was a shock that silenced the room once again. They had thought she was a memory, a ghost, to be dismissed. They had no idea that the old woman had made one final brilliant move before she had left the chessboard, and her checkmate was just about to be revealed. The mention of my wife's name, spoken with such authority by this stranger, was a shock that silenced the room once again. They had thought she was a memory, a ghost, to be dismissed, an old woman whose traditionalist views were now safely in the past. They had no idea that Simone, even from beyond the grave, was the one in control of this room. Greg, who just moments before had been the conquering hero, now looked like a confused, angry trespasser. Lena stared at the lawyer, Mr. Franklin, her face a pale mask of confusion and a dawning terrible fear. Mr. Franklin walked calmly to the table and placed his worn leather briefcase upon its polished surface. The soft, authoritative thud was the only sound. He did not take a seat. He simply stood there, a pillar of calm, commanding the room without raising his voice. He looked at the glossy black folder Greg had so proudly presented to me. "Mr. Ross," the lawyer began, his voice even and precise, "I have been made aware of the 5-year plan you've been developing. A plan to outsource manufacturing, to license the Vance name, to create a more accessible product line." He spoke the words with a faint, almost imperceptible distaste. "An ambitious plan. Tell me, is it customary in your professional experience to discuss the complete dismantling of a company's core principles before the will of its co-founder has even been read?" The question was a quiet, brutal indictment of Greg's arrogance. It hung in the air unanswered. Greg's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "This is a business meeting," he managed to stammer. "We are discussing the future." "Indeed," Mr. Franklin said, his gaze unblinking. "And my client, Mrs. Simone Vance, was a woman of remarkable foresight. She was very concerned with the future. She anticipated that this meeting, the first after her passing, would be contentious. She knew that there would be questions of legacy, of birthright, and of what is rightfully owed." My heart was a heavy drum against my ribs. I had known Simone was planning something. She had told me she had made arrangements, but she had never told me the details. She had simply told me to trust her, to trust the process. And now I was a passenger on this terrible, brilliant ride, just like everyone else in the room. Mr. Franklin opened his briefcase. Greg and Lena leaned forward slightly, their eyes fixed on the case, expecting him to produce a will, a document that would finally clarify their future. But he did not pull out a will. He pulled out a single thick, cream-colored envelope sealed with the official-looking logo of a medical laboratory. My client, Mrs. Vance, the lawyer, continued placing the envelope in the center of the table, believed that a house built on a faulty foundation cannot stand. She believed the same of a family and of a business. She decreed that before any part of her will is read, before any discussion of the company's future takes place, a matter of personal and foundational clarity must first be established once and for all. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle into the tense silence. I looked at my daughter. Lena was twisting a napkin in her lap, her eyes wide with a growing panic. Greg was just staring at the envelope, his brow furrowed in a look of pure, baffled suspicion. A month before her passing, Mr. Franklin stated, his voice now taking on the formal cadence of a man reading a legal declaration. Mrs. Vance, with the full and written consent of all parties involved at the time, arranged for a comprehensive DNA analysis to be conducted. She did so for purposes of genealogical record-keeping, or so she said. Her final non-negotiable instruction to me was that at this first meeting following her death, I was to open this envelope and read the certified results aloud before any other business was to be conducted. The room was utterly, completely silent. A DNA test. The words made no sense. It was a bizarre, nonsensical detour from the business at hand. What on earth did a DNA test have to do with the inheritance of a furniture company? I looked at the envelope and a cold, terrible dread began to creep into my soul. What had you done, Simone? What final, terrible truth had you uncovered? Greg was the first to break the silence. He laughed. It was not a sound of humor. It was a harsh, incredulous bark of disbelief. A DNA test, he scoffed, looking around the room as if expecting everyone to share in the absurdity of the moment. What is this, some kind of daytime television show? Is this a joke? Is the old woman playing games from beyond the grave, Mr. Franklin's expression did not change. He remained impassive, a stone wall of professional calm. I can assure you, Mr. Ross, that my client was not in the habit of playing games, especially not with matters of this gravity. The lawyer's cold certainty seemed to finally pierce Greg's arrogant disbelief, replacing it with a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is absurd," he shouted, his face now a mask of fury. "It's irrelevant. It's a cheap theatrical stunt. We are here to discuss the transition of a multi-million-dollar company, not to indulge in some senile fantasy your client cooked up in her final days." "Henderson," he whirled on his own lawyer, who was sitting silently in the corner looking utterly useless. "Tell him this is inadmissible. Tell him he has no right." "Lena." My daughter finally found her voice. It was a thin, pleading whisper. She looked not at her husband, but at me. "Daddy," she said, her eyes welling with tears of confusion and humiliation. "What is this? What did Mom do? It's private. It's humiliating. You can't let him do this. Please, make him stop." My heart ached for her. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand, a game started by her mother and now being played out against her husband. But I remembered my promise to Simone. I remembered her telling me that the truth, no matter how painful, was the only thing that could ever truly set Lena free. I looked at my daughter, and with the deepest regret I have ever felt, I remained silent. My silence was all the answer she needed. She saw no help would come from me. Her face crumpled in a look of pure, betrayed sorrow. Mr. Franklin, having allowed the emotional storm to pass, spoke again, his voice as calm and unyielding as before. "My instructions are clear, Mr. Ross." "Mrs. Ross," he said, "the reading of your mother's will and any discussion of the future of this company is contingent upon this action. If you wish to refuse, this meeting is over. The will's default clauses, which I can assure you are not in your favor, will be enacted by the state. The choice is yours. It was a perfect trap. There was no way out." Greg stood there, his body trembling with a rage he had no outlet for. He looked at me, his eyes full of hatred. He looked at his crying wife. He looked at the impassive face of Mr. Franklin. And he looked at the sealed envelope on the table. The envelope that held a secret he could not even begin to imagine. He was a man who prided himself on his control, on his ability to dominate any room he was in. And now he was completely, utterly powerless. "Fine," he finally spat the word, a venomous curse. He threw himself back into his chair with a violence that made the wood groan. "Fine. Read your ridiculous piece of paper. Let's get this circus over with so we can get back to the real business." Mr. Franklin gave a single, slow nod. He picked up the envelope from the table. The room was so quiet I could hear the sound of the paper tearing as he broke the seal. He pulled out a single official-looking document. He put on a pair of reading glasses, and he began to read. Mr. Franklin stood at the head of the table, a calm, immovable object in the center of the storm he had just unleashed. The sealed cream-colored envelope lay on the polished mahogany between us, a quiet, unassuming object that now held all the power in the room. A DNA test. The words hung in the air, nonsensical and absurd. I stared at the envelope, a cold, terrible dread creeping into my soul. What had you done, Simone? What final, terrible truth had you uncovered that was so powerful you had orchestrated this entire posthumous drama to reveal it? The stunned silence was broken by a sound that was utterly out of place. Laughter. It was Greg. He threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, incredulous bark of disbelief that echoed in the quiet boardroom. A DNA test, he scoffed, looking around the room as if expecting everyone to share in the absurdity of the moment. Is this a joke? What is this, some kind of daytime television show? He looked from the lawyer's impassive face to my own silent one. Is this your doing, Eli? Did the old woman lose her mind at the end and you decided to play along with this little fantasy? He was trying to regain control, to frame this bizarre turn of events as a senile flight of fancy, a pathetic stunt by a grieving old man. He was trying to put me back in the box he had built for me, the box labeled confused and irrelevant. Mr. Franklin's expression did not change. He remained a stone wall of professional calm. I can assure you, Mr. Ross, he said, his voice quiet, but carrying an immense weight, that my client misses. Simone Vance was of exceptionally sound mind until the very end. She was not in the habit of playing games, especially not with matters of this gravity. The lawyer's cold certainty seemed to finally pierce Greg's arrogant disbelief, and his amusement curdled instantly into a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. He shot to his feet, his chair screeching loudly against the floor, a violent, ugly sound in the tense quiet. This is absurd, he shouted, his face now a mask of fury. It's irrelevant. It's a cheap theatrical stunt. We are here to discuss the orderly transition of a multi-million-dollar company, not to indulge in some posthumous melodrama. He whirled on his own lawyer, Henderson, who was sitting silently in the corner, looking utterly useless and out of his depth. Henderson, do something, Greg commanded. Tell him this is inadmissible. It has no bearing on the business. This is a private family matter. And then he turned that rage on me. This is your doing, isn't it? He spat, his voice a low, venomous hiss. Some pathetic last-ditch effort to hold on to power. You couldn't stand the idea of me taking over of this company finally reaching its full potential. So you've concocted this ridiculous circus to try and stop it, to cheat your own daughter out of her birthright, Lena. My daughter finally found her voice. It was a thin, pleading whisper, the voice of a woman caught in a crossfire she did not understand. She looked not at her furious husband, but at me, her eyes welling with tears of confusion and humiliation. Daddy, she said, her voice trembling. What is this? What did Mom do? Why would she do this to me? It's private. It's our family. It's humiliating. You can't let him do this, please. You're my father. Make him stop. Her plea was a knife in my heart. I looked at the daughter I loved, at the pain and confusion on her face, and every instinct I had as a father screamed at me to protect her, to end this, to make it all go away. But then I remembered my promise to Simone. I remembered her telling me that the truth, no matter how painful, was the only thing that could ever truly set Lena free from the prison of her husband's ambition. I looked at my daughter, my heart breaking for the pain I was about to cause her, and with the deepest regret I have ever felt in my life, I remained silent. My silence was all the answer she needed. She saw no help would come from me. Her face crumpled in a look of pure betrayed sorrow, and she buried her face in her hands. Mr. Franklin, having allowed the emotional storm to reach its peak, spoke again, his voice as calm and unyielding as a force of nature. My instructions from Mrs. Vance are clear and non-negotiable, he said, his gaze fixed on Greg. The reading of her will and any discussion of the future of this company is contingent upon this action. If you wish to refuse, this meeting is over. The will's default clauses, which I can assure you are not in your favor, will be enacted immediately by the state. The choice is yours. It was a perfect, elegant trap. There was no way out. Greg stood there, his body trembling with a rage that had no outlet. He looked at me, his eyes full of a murderous hatred. He looked at his crying, broken wife. He looked at the impassive face of Mr. Franklin, and he looked at the sealed envelope on the table, the envelope that held a secret he could not even begin to imagine, a secret that was now the only thing standing between him and the fortune he had coveted for 20 years. He was a man who prided himself on his control, on his ability to dominate any room he was in. And now he was completely, utterly powerless, his fate resting on a ridiculous piece of paper he did not understand. Fine, he finally spat the word, a venomous curse, a surrender. He threw himself back into his chair with a violence that made the wood groan. Fine, read your ridiculous piece of paper. Let's get this circus over with so we can get back to the real business. Greg had thrown himself back into his chair, a man defeated, a king dethroned in his own mind before the coronation had even begun. His furious, reluctant agreement hung in the air, a surrender born of a trap he could not see but could no longer escape. Fine, he had spat. Read your ridiculous piece of paper. Lena, my daughter, was weeping silently, her face buried in her hands, not out of grief for her mother anymore, but out of a profound and personal humiliation she did not yet understand. And I sat in my chair, a silent observer, my heart a heavy pounding drum against my ribs. I had no idea what was in that envelope. I was as much a passenger on this terrible, brilliant ride as they were. This was Simone's final act, her last secret, and we were all about to witness its unveiling. Mr. Franklin, his face an impassive mask of professional calm, gave a single slow nod. He picked up the thick, cream-colored envelope from the center of the table. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint, dry rasp of his fingertips against the paper. He held it up for a moment, letting us all see the official-looking logo of the laboratory, the unbroken wax seal on the back. This was no cheap theatrical stunt. This was real. With a deliberate, unhurried movement, he took a small silver letter opener from his briefcase. He slid the blade cleanly under the seal and slit the envelope open. The sound of the paper tearing was a violent, shocking rip in the fabric of the silence. It was the sound of a life, of an identity being torn apart. He reached inside and pulled out a single folded document. He unfolded it with the same maddeningly slow precision. He put on a pair of simple, black-framed reading glasses, positioning them carefully on his nose. He took a sip of the water that had sat untouched before him for the last hour. Every small action was a turn of the screw, a tightening of the unbearable tension in the room. Finally, he looked down at the paper and began to read. His voice was not dramatic. It was flat, clinical, and devoid of any emotion, the voice of a man reading a weather report. And that in itself made the words that followed all the more devastating. A report from the Atlanta Genealogical and DNA Diagnostics Laboratory, he began, his voice clear and steady. Case number 734B. The following report details the comparative analysis of submitted genetic markers for the purposes of establishing paternity. He paused and looked up, his gaze sweeping over the room before settling on the document again. Subject A, Elias Vance. Subject B, Lena Vance Ross. Reference sample provided by the estate of Simone Vance. He continued, his voice a relentless factual drone. Based on the allelic comparison across 23 genetic markers, the analysis has reached a definitive conclusion. He paused again. The silence was a living, breathing thing, a monster with its jaws wide open. I could feel my own heart trying to hammer its way out of my chest. And then he delivered the final world-shattering sentence. The probability of paternity for Elias Vance in relation to the subject, Lena Vance Ross, is 0%. Mr. Vance is conclusively excluded as the biological father. 0%. The words did not explode in the room. They landed with a quiet, dense thud, a black hole that seemed to suck all the sound, all the air, all the light out of the world. For a long, suspended moment, nothing happened. No one moved. No one breathed. The statement was so impossible, so fundamentally alien to the reality we had all inhabited for nearly 50 years, that our minds simply refused to accept it. Greg was the first to react, but not in the way I expected. His rage, his anger, it all just vanished. It was replaced by a look of pure, slack-jawed, idiotic incomprehension. His mind was like a complex machine that had just been fed a piece of data it was not programmed to compute. His entire claim, his entire 20-year plan was predicated on a single simple fact that his wife Lena was a Vance, that she was the heir to the Vance legacy, and he had just heard in the cold, irrefutable language of science that she was not. I could almost see the frantic calculations in his eyes, the desperate search for a loophole, for a mistake, for some way to make the words untrue. But there was none. His entire world had just been vaporized. But it was Lena's reaction that truly broke my heart. Her head snapped up, her face streaked with tears. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a pain so profound, so devastating, that it felt like a physical blow. This was not about business for her. This was not about a company or an inheritance. This was about her entire life, her entire identity. The man she had called daddy, the man who had taught her how to ride a bike, the man who had walked her down the aisle was a stranger. Her life, her very name was a lie. The sound that escaped from her lips was not a sob of anger or of grief. It was a small, quiet, wounded cry, the sound of a child who has just discovered that she is an orphan. And me, I was in a state of free fall. The words had hit me with the same force as they had hit everyone else. Lena was not my daughter. My daughter was not my daughter. The scientific certainty of it was at war with the 50 years of fatherly love in my heart. I looked at her, at the beautiful woman who was my child in every way that mattered, and I saw the immense, irreparable pain this truth had just inflicted upon her. In that moment, there was no victory. There was no justice. There was only the terrible hidden cost of my wife's final brilliant plan, Greg's accusation, his desperate sputtering cry of, "It's a lie. It's a trick," echoed in the tomb-like silence of the boardroom. But his words had no substance, no weight. They were the frantic, useless thrashings of a drowning man. The truth, the cold, hard, scientific truth, lay there on the table between us, an immovable object. My gaze was not on him. It was on my daughter, on Lena. She was staring at me, her face a shattered mirror of disbelief and a pain so profound it felt like a physical wound in the room. Her entire life, her entire identity had been demolished in a single clinical sentence. The man she had called daddy, the man whose name she carried, was a stranger. In her eyes, I saw 50 years of love and trust curdle into a terrible unspoken question. Was it all a lie? My heart ached with a sorrow so deep I thought it might split in two. This was the part of Simone's plan I had feared the most, the necessary brutal surgery that would wound the person I loved most in the world in order to save her. I knew I could not let Greg's angry denial be the next voice she heard. She needed the truth, not the cold scientific truth from a piece of paper, but the warm human truth of the heart. I raised a hand, a quiet gesture to Mr. Franklin, who gave me a slow, understanding nod. I pushed my chair back and rose to my feet, my old bones aching with a weariness that had nothing to do with age. I walked around the long, polished table until I was standing beside my daughter's chair. I did not touch her. I simply stood there, a father's protective presence. I did not look at her furious, defeated husband. I spoke only to her. "It's not a lie, Lena," I said, my voice low and heavy with the weight of a 50-year-old secret. "It's not a trick, it's just a truth we never told you. And the reason we never told you was not to deceive you. It was to protect you. It was an act of love." I took a deep breath. It was time to tell the story, our story. "Before you were born," I began, "your mother Simone had a best friend. Her name was Eleanor. They were not just friends, they were closer than sisters. They had grown up together, two little girls in this very city, and they had shared every secret, every dream, every heartbreak. I have never in my life seen a bond as strong as the one between your mother and Eleanor. I remembered them, two vibrant, laughing young women full of life and hope. The memory was so clear, so painful. Eleanor fell in love." I continued, my voice a quiet murmur. "With a man who made her beautiful promises, and then when he found out she was pregnant, he vanished. He left her alone with a broken heart and a new life growing inside her. But she wasn't truly alone. She had Simone, and she had me. Our home was her home. We were going to raise that baby together, the three of us. Your mother was more excited than if it had been her own child. She would spend hours talking to Eleanor's belly, singing to you, telling you all the stories she couldn't wait to share." I looked at Lena. Her weeping had quieted. She was listening, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrible understanding. "The day you were born," I said, my own voice now thick with the memory of that terrible, beautiful day, "was the happiest and the saddest day of our lives. We were at the hospital, Simone and I. We waited for hours. There were complications. The doctors did everything they could, but they couldn't save her. They couldn't save Eleanor. The memory was still a sharp, jagged piece of glass in my heart. Simone's scream when the doctor had told us, the echoing sterile silence of the hallway, the profound world-ending injustice of it all. She was gone, I whispered. But you were here. A perfect, beautiful, tiny little girl with a shock of black hair and your mother's fierce, beautiful eyes. When the nurse placed you in Simone's arms for the first time, something in her changed. Her grief for her best friend was still there, a terrible gaping wound. But a new feeling, a love so fierce, so powerful, so absolute. It rose up and filled that empty space. She looked at you, and you were not just her best friend's child. You were a miracle. You were a promise. I paused, letting the story settle into the room. Greg was silent now, his anger replaced by a stunned, sullen confusion. He was an outsider to this story, an intruder in this sacred history. That night, I went on Simone, and I sat up all night holding you, this tiny, perfect life that had been left in our care. We had been trying for a child of our own for years with no success. And now here you were, a gift that had arrived in the midst of a tragedy. We knew in that moment what we had to do, what our hearts commanded us to do. You were not going to be an orphan. You were not going to be a ward of the state. You were going to be our daughter. We made a decision that night. We would raise you as our own, not as a replacement for the friend she had lost, but as the daughter we had always prayed for. We would give you our name. We would give you our home. We would give you every ounce of the love in our hearts. And we made another decision. We would never tell you. We would never tell you that your life began with a tragedy. We would never let you feel like you were second best or that your place in our family was a matter of circumstance. We wanted your life to begin with love, our love. In our eyes, you were not Eleanor's daughter whom we raised. You were our daughter, period. The biology, the paperwork for the adoption, it was just noise. The love, the unwavering, unconditional love we felt for you, that was the only truth that mattered. I finally looked her in the eyes, my own eyes swimming with tears. And that has never changed, Lena, I said, my voice finally breaking. Not for a single day, not for a single moment in 50 years. In my heart, in my soul, you are my daughter. You will always be my daughter. That piece of paper Mr. Franklin read doesn't change 50 years of life. It doesn't change the scraped knees I bandaged. It doesn't change the bedtime stories I read. It doesn't change the pride I felt watching you graduate. It doesn't change the fact that I was the one who walked you down the aisle on your wedding day. It doesn't change the fact that I love you more than life itself. I had said it all. The whole beautiful, heartbreaking truth. The story of our family. I had not defended myself. I had simply told a love story. And now it was up to her. The story hung in the air between us, a fragile 50-year-old truth that was both a testament to a great love and the source of a profound new pain. I looked at my daughter, Lena, and in her tear-streaked face, I saw a maelstrom of emotions. Shock, hurt, a deep, soul-shaking confusion. But underneath it all, I saw a glimmer of understanding, a dawning recognition of the unconditional love that had been the true foundation of her entire life. For a moment in that raw, heartbreaking silence, I felt a flicker of hope that we could rebuild, that this terrible truth could be a new, more honest beginning for us. But that hope was extinguished by the sound of a single ugly laugh. It was Greg. He had been silent during my story, his mind working, calculating, searching for an angle. And now he had found one. He looked at me, and his face was no longer one of shock. It was a mask of pure reptilian contempt. A love story, he sneered, the words dripping with a venomous sarcasm. Is that what you call it, Eli? I call it a conspiracy. A 50-year-long con. And I have to admit, it's a brilliant one. I'm almost impressed. I just stared at him, my heart growing cold. I had just laid bare the most painful and sacred secret of our family, a story of love and loss and sacrifice, and he was looking at it as if it were a complex business strategy, a clever, hostile takeover he had failed to anticipate. He stood up, his movements now full of a new, furious energy. The shock had worn off, and in its place was the rage of a man who has been cheated out of a prize he believed was his by divine right. He began to pace the room, a caged predator, his mind spinning, building a new narrative, a new lie that would allow him to be the victim, not the villain. So this was the plan all along, wasn't it? He said, his voice rising with a self-righteous fury. You and Simone, you knew for 50 years that Lena wasn't your real daughter. You knew she had no legal claim to the Vance name, to this company. He stopped and pointed a shaking finger at me. You let me marry her. You let me dedicate 20 years of my life, the best years of my life, to building this company. You let me work 60-hour weeks. You let me sacrifice time with my own wife, all in the belief that I was building a future for our family, that I was honoring her birthright. And all the while, you and that old woman, you were holding this card up your sleeve, this perfect little ace in the hole, ready to play it the moment I finally got close to having real control. His ability to twist a story of love into a tale of calculated long-term deceit was breathtaking. He was projecting his own sick transactional worldview onto us, onto the purest thing I had ever known. This isn't about some secret adoption. He spat, his voice dripping with contempt. This isn't about protecting Lena. This is about you, Eli. It's about your ego. You couldn't stand it, could you? You couldn't stand that I was the one who was making this company truly profitable. You with your dusty workshop and your one-of-a-kind commissions, you were running a museum, a hobby. I was the one who turned it into a real scalable business. I was the one who tripled its valuation. And you couldn't stand it. It was killing you to see me succeed where you had been content to just play with your wood. Lena, who had been a silent, weeping statue, finally spoke. Her voice was a small, broken thing. "Greg, stop it," she whispered. "Please, just stop." He whirled on her, his fury now directed at his wife. "No! You don't get it, do you, Lena? You're still not seeing it. This is not your father. This is a manipulative old man who is trying to steal your future from you, from us. He and your mother, they cooked up this entire scheme, this fake DNA test, this hired gun lawyer, this sob story. It's all a lie, designed to do one thing: cut you, and by extension, me, out of what is rightfully ours. The DNA test is court admissible and was certified by the Atlanta Diagnostics Laboratory. Mr. Ross. Mr. Franklin said, his voice a calm, cold stone of fact in the middle of Greg's hysterical storm. "Your accusations are baseless." "Baseless," Greg shrieked, a vein throbbing in his temple. "My wife has been a Vance for 48 years. She has worked here for 25. I have been the CEO for 5. We have poured our lives into this company, and now you're telling us it's all been a lie, that we have no claim. That is what is baseless." I looked at him, at his contorted, furious face, and I felt nothing but a profound, weary pity. He was a man who was so spiritually bankrupt, so completely consumed by the language of money and ownership, that he was incapable of understanding the story I had just told him. He could not comprehend an act that was not motivated by profit. He could not conceive of a love that was not transactional. He was a colorblind man, living in a world of vibrant, beautiful emotion, and all he could see were shades of gray. All he could see were numbers on a spreadsheet. "You came into this room today," I said, my voice quiet, cutting through his rage, "and you spoke of my wife, the woman who gave you your career, who gave you your own wife as the old woman. You spoke of her as an obstacle that had finally been removed. You laid out a plan to take my life's work, our life's work, and turn it into a cheap, mass-produced lie. You told me you were taking my company and that I would have to fend for myself, and you did all of this in the name of your wife's birthright." I stood up, the old aches in my bones forgotten, and I walked until I was standing before him. And now, I said, my voice a low, final judgment, "A piece of paper tells you that the birthright you were so eager to claim does not exist in the way you thought it did. And your first reaction is not to comfort your heartbroken wife. It is not to process the profound family secret that has just been revealed. It is to scream about conspiracies and money and what you believe is owed to you. You are not a victim here, Gregory. You are a disease, a sickness of greed that my wife saw and that she, with her last act on this earth, decided to cure." My words seemed to suck the last of the air from his lungs. He just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no sounds came out. He was finally beginning to understand. He was not in a negotiation. He was in a reckoning. The foundation of his world, the central assumption upon which he had built his entire adult life, had been a lie. And the truth which he now saw as a monstrous conspiracy was a truth he could not and would not accept. His mind, unable to reconcile the two, simply broke. My final words had hung in the air, a quiet final judgment on the man my son-in-law had become. "You are a disease." I had told him a sickness of greed that my wife saw and that she, with her last act on this earth, decided to cure. The furious, self-righteous energy seemed to drain out of him, leaving him sputtering, speechless, a man whose reality had been so thoroughly dismantled he no longer had any ground to stand on. He looked from my face to the weeping form of his wife, and then to the impassive, stony expression of the lawyer, Mr. Franklin, searching for an ally for some purchase in a world that had become a sheer cliff face. It was Mr. Franklin who spoke next. His voice a calm, steady instrument of reason in the chaotic wreckage of the room. He addressed Greg, but his words were for all of us. They were for Lena to begin to heal her wound, and they were for me to finally understand the full, heartbreaking brilliance of my wife's final design. Mr. Ross, the lawyer, began, his tone cool and professional. You speak of a conspiracy, of a 50-year-long con. You are correct that a secret was kept. You are correct that a plan was put in motion. But you have fundamentally mistaken the motives of the conspirators. He paused, letting his words command the room's full attention. Let us first address the secret itself, the matter of Lena's parentage. You frame this as a deception designed to cheat you. You are looking at it through the tainted lens of your own transactional worldview. You are wrong. The keeping of that secret was from its first day to its last, an act of the most profound and protective love. He turned his gaze slightly, and his voice softened as he spoke to my daughter. Lena, he said gently, your mother and Elias made a choice 50 years ago. They chose to shield you from a tragedy. They chose to build your life not on a foundation of loss and abandonment, but on a foundation of absolute unconditional love. They did not want you to grow up as the orphan of a beloved deceased friend. They wanted you to grow up as their daughter. In their hearts and in the eyes of the law, that is what you were and what you are. The secret was not a lie meant to harm you. It was a shield meant to protect you. I watched Lena's face as she listened. Her sobs had quieted. She was hearing the truth of my story now, validated by this calm, authoritative stranger. She was beginning to see the shape of the love that had defined her life, even if its origins were not what she had believed. Franklin then turned his steely gaze back to Greg. Which brings us to the second question. Why reveal this secret now in such a dramatic and painful fashion? The answer to that question, Mr. Ross, is you. The accusation was so direct, so simple, it was like a physical blow. Greg flinched. My client, Mrs. Simone Vance Franklin, spent her final months not just battling a terrible illness, but also observing the state of her family, of her company. And what she saw filled her with a grief that she told me was in many ways more painful than her own diagnosis. She saw you, Mr. Ross. She saw your ambition, which had once been a productive force for the company, curdle into a dangerous, insatiable greed. She saw how you spoke of her husband's life's work, not as a legacy of craft, but as an underperforming asset. She saw you plotting to dismantle the very principles of quality and integrity upon which Vance Designs was built, all for the sake of a quick commercial profit. He knew. Simone had told him everything. She had seen it all. But most painfully, Franklin said, his voice dropping, she saw how you viewed her daughter. Simone came to the heartbreaking conclusion that you did not truly love Lena for who she was. You loved her for what she represented. You saw her not as your partner, but as your key, the key to the Vance kingdom. The birthright, as you so crudely put it, that would one day grant you the absolute control you have always craved. That's a lie, Greg spat, but his voice held no conviction. It was the weak protest of a man who had just heard his own soul described with perfect, damning accuracy. Was it a lie, Mr. Ross? Franklin countered, his voice sharp as a razor, when you told your investors at a private dinner 2 months ago that upon Simone's death, you would have total creative and financial control to finally unlock the brand's real value? My client had a very loyal friend at that dinner. Greg's face went pale. He had been so arrogant, so sure of his own cleverness, that he had never imagined the walls had ears. Simone was faced with a terrible, impossible dilemma. The lawyer concluded, his voice softening again as he looked from my face to Lena's. A choice that no mother should ever have to make. To protect her husband's legacy, the company they had built from nothing, she had to reveal a secret that she knew would deeply wound the daughter she adored. But to protect her daughter from being used, from being a pawn in a greedy man's game for the rest of her life, the truth was the only weapon she had left. She chose to inflict a clean, sharp wound of truth in the hope of saving you both from the slow, festering poison of a life built on a lie. She did it to protect her husband's work, but more than that, she did it to set her daughter free. I looked at my wife's brilliant, terrible, and loving plan, now laid bare for all to see. The sheer incredible strength it must have taken for her to make that choice to bear that burden in her final painful days filled me with a surge of awe so profound it almost took my breath away. She had not been a victim succumbing to illness. She had been a warrior fighting her last, most important battle for us. And as I looked at Lena's face, I saw the dawning, tearful, and ultimately healing realization that her mother's final act was not a betrayal. It was a rescue. My words had landed like stones in the quiet boardroom, a final damning judgment on my son-in-law's character. He stood there speechless for the first time in his life, a man whose entire worldview had been exposed as a hollow, selfish thing. Lena was looking at me, her face a canvas of profound, heartbreaking confusion, but the anger was gone, replaced by the first tentative glimmers of a terrible new understanding. The emotional truth of our family had been laid bare. But my wife, my brilliant, methodical Simone, had known that would not be enough. For a man like Greg, an emotional reckoning was meaningless without a financial one. It was now Mr. Franklin's turn to speak again, to move from the matters of the heart to the cold, hard language that Greg truly understood, the language of the law. Greg, recovering some of his bluster, tried to seize control again. He sneered, a pathetic attempt to regain his lost authority. "This is all very touching," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A real family drama. But it changes nothing. The fact remains that Lena has been a Vance her entire life. She has worked for this company for 25 years. I am the CEO who has tripled its value. We are here to discuss the future of the business. So if you're finished with the theatrics, perhaps we can get back to reality." Mr. Franklin, who had been watching this exchange with a look of calm academic curiosity, gave a slow, deliberate nod. "You are correct, Mr. Ross," he said, his voice returning to its cool, professional tone. "Let us discuss the company. But to do that, you first need to understand what the company you have been running for the past 5 years actually is." Greg just stared at him, a look of pure, arrogant confusion on his face. "I know what it is," he said. "It's Vance Designs. It's a multi-million-dollar luxury brand." "No, Mr. Ross Franklin," said his voice as sharp and clean as a chisel. "It is not." He walked back to his briefcase and took out another thick, blue-bound document. "Do you remember 5 years ago, Mr. Ross, when you were officially promoted to the position of Chief Executive Officer? It was a proud moment for you." "Of course I remember," Greg said impatiently. "It was the beginning of this company's real growth." "Indeed," Franklin said. "And do you remember, as part of that transition, that your mother-in-law Simone insisted on a complete corporate restructuring? She said it was for tax purposes, to streamline operations. You and your lawyer reviewed the documents. You signed them." A flicker of uneasy recognition appeared in Greg's eyes. He remembered. He had seen it as a boring, bureaucratic formality, the meaningless paperwork of the old guard, a final hoop he had to jump through before he could take real control. He had signed it without paying much attention to the details, eager to get to the business of making money. It was, I realized, the single most expensive mistake of his entire life. At that time, Mr. Franklin continued, his voice calm and methodical, as if he were explaining a simple blueprint. "Mrs. Vance, with the full agreement of her husband, created a private, irrevocable trust. It is called the Vance Legacy Trust." He laid the document on the table, and into that trust, she and Elias placed the company's most valuable and, in fact, its only real assets. He paused, letting the words sink in. He then began to list those assets, his voice a slow, deliberate drumbeat of doom. First, the brand name, Vance Designs, the name itself and all its variations. Second, the company logo and all associated brand marks. Third, the copyrights, patents, and intellectual property rights to every single piece of furniture Elias Vance has designed over the last 50 years, the entire back catalog and all future designs. And fourth, he said, delivering the final quiet blow, the company's proprietary client list compiled over a lifetime of business. He stopped and looked at Greg. The sole trustee and lifetime beneficiary of the Vance Legacy Trust, he concluded, his voice utterly flat, is Mr. Elias Vance. The color was draining from Greg's face. He still didn't fully understand the implications, but the predator in him could sense the closing of a cage. So he stammered, his voice losing its confident edge. "So what?" "It's just a legal structure, a holding company for the assets. The company, the one I run, still uses them. It means nothing. "Oh, but it means everything, Mr. Ross," Franklin said. And for the first time I saw a flicker of something like a grim smile on the lawyer's face. "It means that the company you run, the company officially registered as Vance Enterprises, does not in fact own its own name. It does not own the designs it produces. It does not even own its own client list. It is in essence a factory and a showroom with a staff." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a confidential, devastating whisper. "For the past 5 years, Mr. Ross, you have not been the CEO of Vance Designs. You have been the CEO of Vance Enterprises, a company that has been operating under a strict 5-year licensing agreement. An agreement granted by the Vance Legacy Trust, which allows your company to use the Vance name and produce Mr. Vance's designs in exchange for a licensing fee." He straightened up, the final terrible truth now ready to be delivered. "An agreement, I should add," he said, his voice returning to its normal professional volume that came up for its 5-year review last month. "And an agreement that can be terminated at any time for any reason by the sole undisputed decision of the Trust's controlling trustee, Mr. Elias Vance." And there it was, the brilliant, beautiful, terrible truth of my wife's design. I looked at Greg. The arrogant, confident man who had walked into this room was gone, replaced by a man who looked as if he had been physically hollowed out. He was the CEO of nothing. He was the king of a cardboard kingdom. He had spent 5 years of his life, his best, most productive years, building a company that he had just discovered he did not own, a company that could be taken away from him with a single signature, my signature. I thought of Simone, of the quiet secret meetings she must have had with this lawyer, of the fierce protective intelligence she had deployed to build this elegant, inescapable trap. She had not just been preparing for her death. She had been preparing for this very day, for this very moment. She had been sharpening the blade that would at long last cut her daughter free. And as I looked at the stunned, horrified face of my son-in-law, I realized that the true master craftsman in our family had not been me. It had always been her. The truth of the Vance Legacy Trust, the truth that I and I alone controlled the name and the life's work of our company, had settled into the room like a layer of ice. Greg was still reeling from the blow, his mind frantically trying to find a way out, a loophole, some angle he had missed. I could see the desperate calculations in his eyes. He was a cornered animal, and a cornered animal is at its most dangerous. Lena was a silent statue of shock, her gaze flickering between my face and her husband's, a woman caught in the crossfire of a war she had only just discovered was being waged. Greg, in a last desperate attempt to regain control, to assert his own value, finally found his voice. He pushed himself up from his chair, a sneer twisting his pale, sweat-slicked face. "So what?" he spat the words, a desperate, angry bluff. "So what if you own the name? That's a technicality. A legal shell game. The company, the real company, Vance Enterprises, is still worth millions. It has the workshops, it has the employees, the craftsmen I hired and trained. It has the supply chains I negotiated. It has the revenue stream I built. You can't just take that away. Lena and I own the majority of that company. We own the operations, we own the engine. You can have your dusty old brand, we'll keep the factory." He was clinging to the last piece of wreckage he could find, the tangible world of machines and payroll and contracts that he understood. He believed that the body of the company, the part that he managed, was the part that truly mattered. He had always been a man who mistook the engine for the car, the brush for the painting. He had never understood that the soul of Vance Designs was not in its saws and its lathes, but in its name, in its history, in my hands and in my heart. Mr. Franklin, who had been listening to this outburst with the patient, weary air of a man dealing with a particularly stubborn child, gave a slow, sad nod. "You are correct, Mr. Ross," he said, his voice calm and almost gentle. "Let us discuss the company you run. Let's talk about Vance Enterprises." He walked back to his briefcase and took out another file, this one thicker, heavier, filled with financial statements. "You are correct," he repeated, opening the file. "You and your wife are the majority shareholders of Vance Enterprises, and you are correct that Vance Enterprises holds all the operational contracts for the showrooms and employs all 63 of the company's staff members." A flicker of triumphant hope appeared in Greg's eyes. He had found his ground. He had found something that was his. Vance Enterprises. Mr. Franklin continued, his voice utterly flat, as he read from a page, also holds all of the company's substantial debt, The 10-year leases on the high-end showrooms in Atlanta, New York, and Chicago. The multi-million-dollar loan for the new CNC machinery you purchased 2 years ago. The payroll obligations, which, as you know, are considerable. All of the liabilities, all of the risks. They belong entirely to Vance Enterprises, to you. The hope in Greg's eyes began to waver. When your mother-in-law, my client, insisted on the corporate restructuring 5 years ago, the lawyer went on, she performed a classic, and I must say, brilliantly executed corporate maneuver. She separated the valuable intangible and debt-free assets from the high-risk, debt-laden operations. She put the gold in a vault, Mr. Ross, and she left you in charge of the factory. She gave you enough rope and enough money to either build a real sustainable business or to hang yourself with it. The metaphor was so brutal, so perfect, it sucked the air from the room. The Vance Legacy Trust, controlled by Elias Franklin, said, his voice a relentless factual drumbeat, owns the brand name, the proprietary designs, and the exclusive client list. Without those assets, your company Vance Enterprises is just a generic high-end furniture workshop in Atlanta. A workshop with no name of its own, no unique products to sell, and no customers to sell them to. A workshop with millions of dollars in debt. Greg just stared at him, his mouth slightly agape, the full horrifying scope of Simone's brilliant, terrible plan finally beginning to dawn on him. And the licensing agreement, Mr. Franklin said, delivering the final quiet blow, the agreement that for the last 5 years has allowed your company to use those assets to call itself Vance Designs to build my client's copyrighted furniture. That agreement contained a clause, a termination clause. It stated that in the event of the death of either of the original founders, Elias or Simone Vance, the agreement would be subject to an immediate review and could be terminated at the sole discretion of the surviving founder or their legal representative. He closed the file with a soft, final thud. He looked at Greg, his eyes holding not a trace of malice, but only the cold, hard finality of the law. Mr. Ross, he said, on behalf of my client, Mrs. Simone Vance, and under the authority of the sole trustee of the Vance Legacy Trust, Mr. Elias Vance, I am hereby informing you that that licensing agreement is as of this moment terminated. And there it was. Checkmate. The final elegant and absolutely devastating move in a game Greg had never even known he was playing. He stumbled backward, collapsing into his chair. The sound he made was not a shout of anger. It was a low, gutterating gasp, the sound of a man whose entire world has just been vaporized in an instant. His 20 years of work, the tripling of the company's valuation, his ambition, his future. It had all been an illusion. He had not been building his own empire. He had been a manager, a glorified middle manager running a subsidiary on behalf of a queen he had foolishly mistaken for a doddering old woman. His entire professional identity was a sham, a lie he had told himself and the world. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a horrified, pleading disbelief. I did not smile. I felt no joy in this victory. I was a builder, and I had just witnessed the complete and utter demolition of a man. It was a tragic, ugly, and necessary thing. I thought of Simone, of the cold, brilliant, and ultimately protective love that had driven her to this. This was not just about punishing Greg. It was about saving the soul of the company we had built together, the company he had been so determined to corrupt. So yes, Mr. Ross, Mr. Franklin said into the profound, ringing silence, you are as of today the proud majority owner of Vance Enterprises, a company with significant debt, massive overhead, and as of this moment, no name, no products, and no customers. You are the king of an empty castle. The lawyer's final words had landed in the silent boardroom with the force of a wrecking ball. You are the king of an empty castle. The metaphor was so perfect, so brutal, so complete that it seemed to suck all the remaining air out of the room. Greg sat in his chair, his body rigid, his face a mask of utter hollowed-out shock. His entire professional life, the 20 years of work he had seen as a masterful climb to power, had just been revealed as a sham. He had not been a king building his own empire. He had been a glorified court jester allowed to play with the kingdom's resources, all while the true queen, my Simone, had held the real power in a trust he never even knew existed. For a long, terrible moment, there was only silence. It was the silence of a building just after the demolition charges have gone off in the split second before the structure begins to collapse. I watched my son-in-law and I saw the intricate facade of his confidence begin to crack. The smug certainty, the arrogant self-assurance, it all began to crumble, revealing the frantic, terrified man beneath. Then he made a sound. It was not a shout of anger, it was a laugh. A single sharp, hysterical bark of a laugh that was completely devoid of humor. It was the sound of a mind breaking, the sound of a man's entire reality being turned inside out so violently that the only possible response was a kind of madness. An empty castle, he whispered to himself, the laugh dying in his throat, replaced by a look of profound, uncomprehending disbelief. And then the disbelief curdled into a tidal wave of pure, unrestrained rage. He shot to his feet, his chair flying backward and crashing into the wall behind him. "No!" he screamed, the sound a raw, animalistic cry of fury. "No, this is a lie. It's all a lie, a legal trick." He whirled on me, his eyes wild, his face a contorted mask of hatred. "You," he spat, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You and that manipulative old woman. This was your plan all along. A 50-year con." I said nothing. I just sat there, my hands resting on the table, a calm, sad observer to his complete and utter unraveling. My silence, my lack of fear, only seemed to fuel his fury. "You let me marry her!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "You let me dedicate my life, the best years of my life, to building this company. I took your dusty little workshop, your precious little hobby, and I made it a powerhouse. I was the one in the meetings in New York and Milan. I was the one signing the multi-million-dollar deals. I was the one working until midnight, sacrificing my life while you were in your workshop, playing with your chisels, pretending to be some kind of artist." He was pacing the room now, a caged tiger, his movements jerky and violent. He swept a stack of papers from the table, sending them fluttering to the floor. "I built this," he roared, thumping his chest with his fist. "Me, not you. I took your sleepy little name and I made it a global brand. I tripled the revenue. I quadrupled the valuation. I did that. And now you're trying to tell me it's all worthless, that it all belongs to you." I looked at my daughter, Lena. She was watching her husband, the man she had loved, the man she had deferred to for 2 decades, and her face was a mask of dawning, horrified disgust. She was not seeing a powerful, wronged man. She was seeing a spoiled, screaming child, a boy who was throwing a tantrum because his favorite toy had been taken away. She was finally seeing the monster her mother had tried to protect her from. Greg, oblivious to his wife's reaction, turned his fury on Mr. Franklin. "And you," he snarled, "her hired gun. How much did she pay you to cook up this scheme, to forge these documents? This is a fraud. This is theft, Mr. Ross." Franklin said, his voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's heart rate. "Every document is legally sound and has been filed with the state of Georgia for the past 5 years. Your own corporate counsel reviewed and signed off on the restructuring. Your failure to comprehend the terms of an agreement you willingly entered into does not constitute fraud on our part." The cold legal finality of Franklin's words seemed to finally break through Greg's rage, leaving him exposed and sputtering. "But my work," he whispered, his voice now a pathetic, pleading sound. "My 20 years. My effort. It has to be worth something. It's not fair. It's not right. You can't just take it all away." He had finally arrived at the pathetic, childish core of his entire being. It's not fair. He was a man who had never shown an ounce of fairness, a man who had just tried to steal my home and my life's work, and now he was appealing to a sense of justice he had never possessed. I looked at him, at this broken, pathetic man, and I felt nothing but a profound, weary pity. Not for the man he was now, but for the man he could have been if his soul had not been so completely consumed by the sickness of greed. He said he had built my company, but he had built nothing. He had only sold what I had created. He was a salesman, not a builder. He had never understood the difference. He had never understood that the soul of the company was not in the revenue stream, but in the integrity of the work, in the honesty of the wood, in the love that went into every single piece. It was a language he had never learned to speak, and a world he could never, ever own. His rage finally exhausted itself, and he collapsed back into his chair, not with anger anymore, but with a hollow, empty, and all-consuming despair. The king was dead, and his castle had been revealed to be nothing but a mirage. The storm of Greg's fury had finally broken, leaving behind a profound and ugly silence. He was a collapsed ruin in his chair, a man who had screamed and raged against a truth as unmovable as a mountain and had been utterly broken by it. His tantrum had been a pathetic final display of the entitled weakness that had been the rotting core of his character all along. The boardroom was a wreck, papers scattered across the floor like fallen leaves after a hurricane. And in the center of it all, my son-in-law sat a hollowed-out man, the king of a cardboard castle that had just been washed away by a tide of truth. I looked at him, at this man who had been a part of my family for 2 decades, and I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, no satisfaction. He was simply irrelevant, a ghost, a footnote in a story that was no longer about him. My story, Simone's story, was now about the woman who sat beside him, the woman who was the true innocent victim in this entire tragic affair. My daughter, Lena. I turned away from Greg, a deliberate final act of dismissal. I acted as if he were no longer in the room, as if his furious, pathetic presence had simply evaporated. I walked around the long, polished table and pulled up a chair, placing it directly in front of my daughter. She was still weeping, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the day's revelations. She would not look at me. Her gaze was fixed on the scattered papers on the floor, on the wreckage of the life she thought she had. I sat down so that we were at eye level. I did not reach out to touch her. I knew that my touch, the touch of the man who was the source of her pain, would not be a comfort. Not yet. I just sat there in the quiet, and I waited for her sobs to subside into ragged, hiccuping breaths. Lena, I finally said, my voice quiet, gentle, and heavy with the sorrow of a father who knows he has just broken his daughter's heart. Look at me. Slowly, reluctantly, she lifted her head. Her face was a mess of tears and confusion. Her eyes were full of a pain so profound it felt like a physical blow. She was looking at me, but she was seeing a stranger, a man who had upended her entire world. I know this is a terrible day, I began, my voice a soft murmur. I know your heart is broken. I know that the truth is a hard, heavy thing to carry. If there had been any other way at all to protect you, your mother and I would have taken it. But there wasn't. And now a choice has to be made. She just stared at me, her expression lost, confused. For 20 years, my child, I continued, my voice full of a love I hoped she could still feel. You have been trying to live in 2 different worlds and 2 different stories. On one side, there is the story your mother and I built. It is a quiet story, a story of love, of craft, of integrity. A story that is built on the simple, honest truth of a piece of wood, of a well-made joint. It is a story that began for you on the day we took you into our arms and loved you, not as a replacement for a friend we had lost, but as the daughter we had always prayed for. That is our story. It is the legacy of Vance Designs. I paused, letting the words settle. And then I said, gesturing slightly without looking toward the broken form of her husband, there is his story. It is a loud story, a story of numbers, of ambition, of profit and loss. It is a story where people and names and even love are just assets to be leveraged. A story where a family home is a cornerstone parcel, and a life's work is a brand to be commercialized. It is a story where the truth is a flexible, negotiable thing, a tool to be used to get what you want. I leaned forward, my eyes holding hers, willing her to see, to understand. You have tried to honor both stories for so long. You have tried to be my daughter, the child of the craftsman. And you have tried to be his wife, the partner of the CEO. And I have watched it tear you apart. I have watched you stand in the middle, trying to bridge a gap that can never be bridged, a chasm between 2 worlds that do not speak the same language. But you can't anymore, Lena, I said, my voice now firm with a sad, final authority. The time for that is over. The truth of this day has burned that bridge to the ground. And now you are standing on one side of the chasm, and you have to choose. You have to choose which story you belong to. You have to choose what your name, the name I gave you, the name Vance, truly means to you. Does it mean a legacy of creation, of love, of quiet, honest work? Or does it mean a hollow shell, a brand to be sold, a partnership in a life built on a foundation of lies? Greg, who had been a silent, defeated heap in his chair, seemed to sense that he was losing her. He made one last pathetic plea. Lena, don't listen to him. He croaked, his voice a weak, pathetic shadow of his earlier rage. He's trying to manipulate you. He's trying to turn you against me. We're a team, you and me. We can still fight this. We can sue him. We can... His words trailed off, because Lena was not looking at him. She was looking at me, and in her eyes for the first time I saw the fog of her divided loyalties begin to clear. His final, desperate, selfish plea, his talk of fighting and suing, was the last piece of evidence she needed. She was finally seeing him for what he was, a weak, greedy man who had used her name and her love as a stepping stone on his own path to ruin. And she was finally seeing her mother's last terrible act, not as a betrayal, but as a rescue. I had given her the choice. An impossible, heartbreaking choice. But in my heart I knew it was the only real gift I could ever give her. Not a company, not an inheritance, but the chance for the first time in her adult life to choose her own story. The question hung in the air, a terrible, necessary choice presented to my heartbroken daughter. Choose a story. Choose a life. My story, a story of quiet love and creation. Or his story, a story of loud, empty ambition. For 20 years she had tried to live in both worlds, her heart torn between the father who had raised her and the husband she had chosen. Now the bridge between those two worlds was a pile of ash on the boardroom floor, and she was forced to choose which side she would stand on. I watched her, my heart aching with a father's love, a father's fear. I had given her the choice, but I had no idea what she would do. The habit of a lifetime, the instinct to stand by her husband, was a powerful gravitational force. I steeled myself for the possibility that she would choose him, that I would lose her for a second and final time today. Greg, sensing her hesitation, sensing his last chance slipping away, made one final pathetic plea. "Lena, baby, don't listen to him." He croaked, his voice a weak, desperate thing. He reached for her hand across the table. "He's trying to manipulate you. He's trying to turn you against me. We're a team, you and me. We can still fight this. We can sue him. We can—" He stopped, because Lena had pulled her hand away from his touch as if his skin were red-hot iron. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry out. She just moved her hand back into her own lap, a small, quiet, and devastatingly final gesture of rejection. She did not look at me. She looked at her husband, at the man she had shared a bed with for 2 decades, the man she had built a life with. But she was not looking at him with love, or with loyalty, or even with hatred. She was looking at him with a kind of clear, cold, and terrible pity, the look of a doctor examining a disease she has finally and correctly diagnosed. The silence stretched on, and then she spoke. Her voice was not the trembling, uncertain whisper it had been just moments before. It was a new voice, a voice that was quiet but clear and full of a hard-won, painful strength. "My mother is dead." She began, her words simple, factual, and utterly heartbreaking. "The man who I have called my father my entire life has just told me he is not my father. My whole world, everything I thought was true, has been erased in the space of an hour." She paused, taking a ragged breath. "And you?" she said, her eyes fixed on Greg's face. "You have not looked at me once. Not once. You have not asked me if I am okay. You have not held my hand. You have not offered a single word of comfort. Your first and only reaction to the complete and utter demolition of my life has been to scream about your career, about your money, about what you believe is owed to you." Greg opened his mouth to object, to defend himself, but she held up a hand, and the sheer, unyielding authority in the gesture silenced him. "My father," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "asked me to choose a story. And for the first time today, everything is perfectly clear. I see the 2 stories. And I see that you and I were never ever in the same one. I thought we were in a love story, Greg. A partnership. A life we were building together." She shook her head, a slow, sad gesture of disillusionment. "But I was wrong. I was in a love story. You were in a business transaction. And I was not your partner. I was your primary asset. I was the birthright you were so eager to cash in." With a calm, deliberate movement, she began to slide the heavy diamond wedding ring from her finger. It was a ring he had given her, a ring I now knew had been paid for with money borrowed against the future value of my company. It was not a symbol of love. It was part of the down payment on his investment. This transaction, she said, her voice now as cold and clear as glass, is over. She placed the ring on the polished mahogany table between them. It spun for a moment, a glittering, expensive top, before coming to a rest. The sound of the diamond clicking against the wood was as final and as loud as a gunshot in the silent room. Greg just stared at the ring, then at her face, his expression one of pure, uncomprehending shock. This was the one scenario he had never planned for. This was the one asset he had never imagined he could lose. He had seen her as a part of himself, a possession, a tool, and the tool had just declared its independence. He had lost the company. He had lost the money. And now in this final, devastating moment, he had lost the wife who had been his key to it all. He had nothing left. Lena finally turned her gaze to me. Her eyes were full of a pain and a sorrow so deep I felt it in my own soul. But underneath it I saw something new. I saw a flicker of her mother's strength. I saw the first faint light of a woman who was finally, and for the first time, free. She had chosen her story. She had chosen the truth. She had come home. And as our eyes met across the wreckage of that room, I felt the immense crushing weight of my promise to Simone finally and completely lift. My daughter's wedding ring lay on the polished mahogany table, a small, glittering tombstone for a 20-year marriage. The sound of it clicking against the wood had been the final note in the symphony of Greg's destruction. He just stared at it, his face a hollow, empty mask. He had lost the company. He had lost the money. He had lost the woman who had been his key to it all. He had nothing left. He was a king without a kingdom, a husband without a wife, a man without a future. The storm of his fury had passed, leaving behind only the quiet, pathetic wreckage of a broken man. The room was thick with the aftermath of the battle. Lena was still weeping, but her sobs were different now. They were not the loud, hysterical cries of a woman in shock, but the quiet, ragged sobs of a woman who was beginning the long, painful process of mourning a life that had turned out to be a lie. The air was heavy with unspoken words, with the ghosts of the past and the terrifying uncertainty of the future. The war was over, and now the cleanup had to begin. I looked at the man who had been my son-in-law, at the shell of a man who sat slumped in his chair, and I felt no triumph. I felt only a profound and weary sadness for the terrible waste of it all. He was a cancer that had been allowed to grow for too long, and my wife, my brilliant Simone, had known that the only cure was a radical, painful excision. And it was my duty to make the final cut. With a calm, steady hand, I reached for the conference phone that sat in the center of the table. My movements were slow, deliberate. I pressed a single button, a prearranged signal. A quiet voice, the voice of my longtime assistant James, came through the speaker. "Yes, Mr. Vance, James," I said, my voice calm and professional. The voice of the founder. The voice of the man who was now once again in charge. "Please come to the boardroom and ask our head of security, Mr. Harris, to join you. We have a matter to attend to." "Right away, sir," he replied. I disconnected the call. Greg looked up at me. A flicker of his old arrogant defiance mixed with a new dawning terror. "What are you doing?" he whispered, his voice a hoarse croak. I did not answer him. I did not even look at him. I simply looked at my daughter Lena, and in her eyes I saw the first flicker of a new and terrible understanding of the finality of this moment. A minute later, the boardroom door opened. 2 men entered. The first was James, my loyal assistant for over 30 years. The second was Mr. Harris, our head of security, a large, impassive man whose presence alone commanded respect. They were professional, their faces unreadable. They walked into the room and stood by the door, their eyes on me, waiting for their instructions. They completely and pointedly ignored the man who just an hour ago had been their CEO. It was a small, quiet, and utterly devastating display of the new reality. Greg was no longer in charge. He was no longer a factor. He was simply an object in a room waiting to be moved. I finally turned my gaze to my son-in-law. "Gregory." I said, my voice cold and devoid of any emotion. I did not call him Greg. I did not call him son. I called him by the name of a stranger, a business associate whose contract was now terminated. He flinched at the sound of his full name. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice now directed at the 2 men by the door, Mr. Ross's employment with Vance Enterprises and any and all of its affiliates has been terminated effective immediately. His access to this building and to all company property is hereby revoked. I watched as the last traces of color drained from Greg's face. "Please escort him from the premises." I continued, my voice a calm, relentless instrument of consequence. "He is to be allowed to collect only his personal, non-company-related belongings from his office, and he will do so under your direct supervision. Once he has his things, you will escort him to the parking garage and ensure that he leaves the property. From this moment forward, he is no longer permitted on these grounds. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." Mr. Vance Harris said, his voice a low, professional rumble. The two security guards walked toward Greg. He looked at them, then at me, his eyes wide with a final desperate pleading disbelief. "You can't do this," he whispered. "Elias, please. This company, it's my life." "No," I said, my voice a final quiet judgment. "This company was my life. And you tried to steal it. You are lucky to be leaving with only your coat. Now go." The guards reached him. They did not grab him. They did not manhandle him. Their professionalism was in itself a form of humiliation. They simply stood on either side of him, their presence an unyielding physical fact. One of them placed a firm, quiet hand on his arm. "Sir," he said, his voice polite but firm, "it's time to go." And in that moment, all the fight, all the rage, all the arrogant bluster finally went out of him. He was a broken man. He allowed them to pull him to his feet. He stumbled, a man whose legs could no longer support the weight of his own failure. As they led him toward the door, he looked back one last time. He looked at the wreckage on the table. He looked at the daughter who would not look at him, and he looked at me. In his eyes I saw not hatred, but a vast, empty, and bottomless despair. Then he was gone. The door closed behind him, the sound a soft, final click. The cancer had been removed, and the room was left in a profound, terrible, and finally clean silence. The door closed behind Greg, the sound a soft, final click that seemed to echo in the cavernous silence of the boardroom. He was gone. The cancer, the disease of greed that had been slowly consuming our family from the inside out, had been removed. The room was left in a profound, terrible, and finally clean silence. My daughter Lena was still in her chair, her body trembling with quiet, ragged sobs. Her wedding ring, a small, glittering island of ruin on the vast, polished sea of the table. The war was over, but the battlefield was littered with the wreckage of her life, and the work of rebuilding seemed an impossible, monumental task. I looked at Mr. Franklin. He stood by the table, his face a mask of professional calm, but in his eyes I saw a deep and weary sadness. He had been a soldier in this war too, a loyal general executing his queen's final brilliant and heartbreaking campaign. He had seen the cost of this victory up close. He gave a slow nod, as if confirming to himself that the most difficult part was over. "She is free now, Elias," he said quietly, his gaze softening as he looked at Lena's weeping form. It was a terrible price to pay for her freedom, but Simone believed it was the only price that would ever be accepted. "I know," I said, my voice hoarse. "Thank you, Arthur. For everything. For honoring her wishes so perfectly. It was the greatest honor of my professional life," he replied simply. He began to gather his papers to pack his briefcase, preparing to leave us to the quiet, difficult work of grieving and healing. He was a man who knew when his part in the play was over, but then he paused, his hand inside his briefcase. "There is one last thing," he said, his expression becoming grave once more. He looked at Lena, then back at me, a silent question in his eyes. He was asking for my permission to proceed with the final terrible act. I understood. I walked over to my daughter and knelt beside her chair, my old knees protesting with a sharp stabbing pain. I placed a hand on her arm. She flinched at my touch, then leaned into it, her body finally accepting a comfort it so desperately needed. "Lena," I said softly, my voice a low murmur meant only for her. "There's one more letter from your mother. It's for me. But I want you to hear it too. I believe she would want you to. There will be no more secrets between us, not ever again." She looked up at me, her face a mess of tears and confusion, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She was exhausted, broken, but she was still here. She was still fighting. I looked at Franklin. "Please," I said. He nodded and pulled a final sealed envelope from his briefcase. It was the same cream-colored paper as the DNA report, and on the front in Simone's elegant, familiar script was a single word, Elias. He did not open it. He simply handed it to me. My hands trembled as I took it. This was not a legal document. This was a final, personal message from the love of my life. A voice from the other side, a final piece of the puzzle I didn't even know was missing. I broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. I began to read aloud, my voice, a low, unsteady murmur in the quiet room, a final conversation with my wife for all to hear. "My dearest darling Elias," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then the worst is over. The truth is out. And I know your heart is breaking not just for the loss of me, but for the loss of the family we thought we had. I am so sorry, my love, for the pain I have put you through. I am sorry for the secrets I had to keep, and for the terrible necessary performance I asked of you. Please forgive me. I had to stop my own tears blurring the words on the page. I took a ragged breath and continued, my voice gaining a bit of her strength as I spoke her words. There is one final piece of the plan you must know. It is the ugliest part, the part I am most ashamed of, but it was a fail-safe I knew I had to build. It concerns Gregory and the company. He was so determined to possess the company he was running into the ground. I saw Lena flinch at the mention of his name, but she did not look away. She was listening. For the last 2 years I read Simone's words, a cold, clear accounting of her son-in-law's sins. I have been watching him. I am not a business genius like him, my love, but I am the daughter of a shopkeeper, and I know how to read a ledger. I saw the reckless spending, the expensive leases on showrooms. We didn't need the business trips that were nothing more than luxury vacations. I saw him treating Vance Enterprises not as a legacy to be nurtured, but as his own personal piggy bank. He was running the company on a mountain of debt, borrowing from private equity firms, taking out lines of credit with suppliers, all against the future profits he was so certain he would inherit. He was a gambler. Elias, the letter continued, and the words were a quiet, terrible indictment. He was using our name and our reputation as his chips at a high-stakes table he was destined to lose at. He was so blinded by his own ambition, he never imagined that the house might have a different dealer. So I did something, my love, the letter continued, and I could feel the steel in her words, the final, brilliant, and ruthless move of a master chess player. I knew that even with the trust, even with the truth about Lena, he might still find a way to survive, to drag the operational side of the company down with him in a mess of lawsuits and bankruptcy, leaving you with nothing but a brand and a pile of legal ashes. So through a series of anonymous holding companies, I had Mr. Franklin begin to buy his debt. I stopped reading the words on the page, so shocking, so audacious that I had to read them again to believe them. I looked up at Mr. Franklin. He just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was all true. I looked at Lena. Her eyes were wide with a new, dawning awe. I returned to the letter, my voice a hoarse whisper. The loans from the private equity firms, the lines of credit with the suppliers. One by one we bought them. It was a terrible, ugly business, but it was necessary. I became the bank Elias. In his frantic, desperate search for more money, he was unknowingly borrowing from me. I became his primary and his most unforgiving creditor. He never knew. He thought he was just shuffling his debts around, borrowing from Peter to pay Paul. He had no idea that all of his debts, all of his obligations were slowly, surely being consolidated into one single powerful entity, my estate. He was in a cage of his own making, and he never even saw the bars. This was my final fail-safe, my love. I hoped it would never have to be used. I hoped that the truth would be enough, that he would see the error of his ways and walk away. But I knew the sickness in him was deep. This was the final cure. He could not be allowed to survive, to rise from the ashes of his own making, and to one day become a threat to you or to Lena again. I folded the letter, my hands shaking. The sheer, ruthless brilliance of her plan was a thing of terrible beauty. She had not just built a fortress to protect us. She had built a cannon, aimed it at the heart of her enemy, and had patiently waited for the right moment to light the fuse. Mr. Franklin spoke, his voice now taking on the formal final tone of an executioner. As the executor of Simone Vance's estate, he said, "My primary duty is to settle all outstanding debts owed to the estate. The largest single debtor is in fact Vance Enterprises, the company Mr. Ross was managing. The total amount owed to the estate is in excess of $4 million. He let that number hang in the air. Therefore, he continued, I am legally obligated to call in those debts. Since Vance Enterprises is now a shell company with no brand, no proprietary designs, and no clients, it has no conceivable way to repay what it owes. As such, I will be filing for the immediate and total liquidation of Vance Enterprises to recoup whatever value is left for the estate." He then looked at Lena, his expression softening with a hint of pity. "And because Mr. Ross, in his arrogance, personally guaranteed many of those loans, the liquidation of the company will almost certainly trigger his personal bankruptcy. Greg hadn't just lost his company. He was about to be devoured by it." I looked at Lena. Her face was no longer just a mask of pain. A new expression was dawning in her eyes. It was a look of profound heartbreaking and ultimately liberating understanding. She finally saw it all. Her mother had not been a victim. She had been a warrior, a queen, and her final act had been to burn down the whole rotten kingdom just to save the people she loved. The weeks that followed the day of the reckoning were a time of profound and quiet adjustment. I was a man relearning the language of his own life, a life now free from the constant low-grade hum of conflict and deceit. I did not move. I did not pack. I simply stayed in my home, my fortress, the place Simone had so brilliantly secured for me. I spent my days in the workshop, not yet building, but simply cleaning, organizing, reacquainting myself with the tools and the scent of the wood. It was a period of quiet contemplation, of letting the dust of a great and terrible battle finally settle. I did not seek out news of Gregory. I did not need to. The consequences of that day in the boardroom were not a private affair. They were a slow, public, and inevitable collapse. A story that unfolded in the city's business pages and in the quiet, factual phone calls I would receive from Mr. Franklin. He knew I needed to know, not for the sake of vengeance, but for the sake of closure. Each phone call was a quiet, somber report on the inevitable demolition of a man who had built his life on a foundation of lies. The first update came about a month after Greg had been escorted from the building. I was in my study looking over some of Simone's old design sketches when the burner phone, the one I now kept for my conversations with Franklin, rang. Elias, his calm, professional voice began. "I have an update for you regarding Vance Enterprises. As we discussed and as per my duty as the executor of Simone's estate, I formally called in all outstanding debts. As expected, the company had no means to pay." He paused. "The court has approved our petition for an involuntary liquidation. The process has begun. The company that Mr. Ross was managing officially ceased to exist as of 9 a.m. this morning." The words were so simple, so final. A company, a thing that had employed dozens of people, that had been a part of my life for 50 years, had been extinguished with the stroke of a judge's pen. "The assets of the company," Franklin continued, "the furniture in the showrooms, the office equipment, the delivery trucks, they will all be sold at auction to pay a fraction of the debt owed to the estate. It will not come close to covering the full amount, of course." And Gregory asked, my voice quiet. As we anticipated, Franklin said, his voice holding no triumph, only a weary finality, because Mr. Ross had personally guaranteed several of the largest loans to fund his aggressive expansion. The liquidation of the company triggered his own personal liability. He filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy last week. He has lost everything, Elias. His house, his cars, his savings, it's all gone. I hung up the phone and sat there in the quiet of my study, the room where I had once listened to my son-in-law lay out his grand, ambitious plans. I felt no joy. I felt no satisfaction. I felt only a profound and hollow sadness. Bankruptcy was not a victory. It was a ruin. It was the tragic, inevitable end of a life lived too far beyond its means, a life fueled by a desperate, insatiable hunger for more. The next update came 6 weeks later. This time the news was not just financial, it was criminal. Elias, Franklin said, his voice even more grave than before, "The district attorney's office has convened a grand jury. They have decided to press charges against Gregory." I had been expecting it, but the reality of it was still a shock. "The case is stronger than I had even anticipated," Franklin explained. "It seems your wife's research was impeccable. In her final months, she had not just been observing his business practices. She had been documenting them. She had compiled a detailed file on at least 3 separate occasions where Gregory had used fraudulent profit projections and falsified asset reports to secure the very loans her estate now owns. He wasn't just a reckless businessman, Elias. In the eyes of the law, he was a con artist. This news was not a quiet phone call. This was a headline on the front page of the Atlanta Business Chronicle, a paper that had once celebrated Greg as a rising star in the city's business community. Atlanta CEO indicted for fraud. I read the story, and it was all there. The details of his shell company, the testimony of his angry ex-partners, the accusations of a long and calculated campaign of financial deceit. The Vance name, the name I had worked my entire life to make a symbol of integrity and quality, was now linked, however indirectly, to his disgrace. The final report on the fate of Gregory Ross came not from a phone call, but from a quiet, sad letter from my daughter Lena several months after that. She told me that Greg, facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence, had taken a plea deal. He had been sentenced to 3 years in a minimum security federal prison. His name was a pariah in the business world he had once so desperately wanted to conquer. His friends had abandoned him. His social life was a wasteland. He was a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. The man who had once commanded boardrooms was now just a number in a system stripped of his expensive suits, his fancy titles, and the arrogant self-assurance that had been his only real asset. I folded the letter and looked out my window at the quiet, honest beauty of the trees in my yard. I thought of the young, ambitious man I had first met 20 years ago, a man who had seemed so full of promise. And I tried for the 100th time to pinpoint the exact moment when his ambition had curdled into a sickness, the moment his drive had become a destructive obsession. I could not find it. It had been a slow, insidious decay, a series of 1,000 small compromises and 1,000,000 tiny lies he had told himself. I took no pleasure in his fall. I only felt a deep, profound sorrow for the waste of it all. Simone's plan had not been to send him to prison. Her plan had been to stop him. The justice she had designed was to hold him accountable, to force him to confront the truth of his own character. His final pathetic ruin was not her creation. It was a structure he had built for himself, lie by lie, debt by debt. And now he was finally forced to live in it. The news of Greg's final inevitable ruin, delivered with such cold legal precision by Mr. Franklin, did not bring me any satisfaction. It was simply the last ugly piece of a story that was now mercifully over. The war was won. The promise to my wife was kept. But the victory felt like standing alone in a field of ashes. After Mr. Franklin had gone, leaving behind a stack of documents that represented my new life, a profound and heavy silence settled over the wrecked boardroom. It was just me and Lena, the two survivors of Simone's terrible, beautiful, and necessary war. She was still sitting at the table, a fragile porcelain statue in the midst of the chaos. Her weeping had subsided, leaving behind a stillness that was more alarming than her tears. She was staring at the single glittering diamond ring that lay on the polished mahogany, a tombstone for a 20-year marriage, and a life she had just discovered was a lie. She was a woman adrift. Her past erased her future, a terrifying blank page. The pain and confusion in her eyes was a wound so deep, I was afraid my love would not be enough to heal it. I walked around the long table and pulled up a chair not opposite her, but beside her, closing the physical and emotional distance between us. For a long time, I just sat there in the quiet, simply being with her in her pain, a father waiting for his child to be ready to be comforted. Finally, she spoke, her voice a dry, broken whisper, her eyes still fixed on the ring. "You're not my father," she said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of profound, soul-crushing loss. She was not just mourning the loss of a husband and a fortune. She was mourning the loss of her own identity. My heart ached with a sorrow so deep I thought it might split in two. This was the wound my wife had known her plan would inflict. The clean, sharp wound of truth she had believed was necessary to save her daughter from the slow, festering poison of a life built on lies. "The blood in our veins may be different, Lena," I said, my voice low and gentle. "But the love in my heart is not. You are my daughter. That is a truth that no piece of paper, no scientific test can ever change." She finally looked up at me, her eyes a storm of hurt and betrayal. Then why, she whispered the question, a raw, open wound. Why did you lie to me? My whole life. Why? I took a deep breath, knowing my next words were the most important I would ever speak. "It was not a lie, my child," I said, my voice full of the love and the sorrow of the last 50 years. "It was a story your mother and I chose to write for you. The day you were born, the world had taken your birth mother, Eleanor, from you. It had left you an orphan, a life that was set to begin with a tragedy. Your mother, Simone, she could not bear that. She looked at you, this perfect, beautiful miracle, and she decided that your story would not start with loss. It would start with love. Our love." I told her again the story of that day, of her mother's fierce, protective love that had bloomed in the midst of her own profound grief. "We didn't want you to ever feel like you were second best." I explained, my own tears now falling freely. "We didn't want you to feel like you were a replacement for a friend we had lost, or a child we could not have. We wanted you to know in the deepest part of your soul that you were simply and completely our daughter, that you were chosen, that you were wanted. The biology, the paperwork for the adoption, it was just noise. The love was the only truth that mattered." But Mom knew, she said, her voice full of a new kind of pain, the pain of a secret kept. She knew this whole time. And she used it. She used it to destroy my husband, to destroy my life. No, baby, no, I said, my voice pleading for her to understand. She didn't use it to destroy him. She used it to save you from him. I had to make her see. Your mother didn't hate Greg. In the end, I don't think she felt anything for him at all but a profound, weary pity. But she saw him. She saw his sickness. She saw that he didn't love you for you, but for the name you carried, for the company he believed you would one day inherit. She saw that you were not his partner. You were his key. And it was breaking her heart to watch him use you, to watch his greed slowly poison your own beautiful soul. I reached across the small space between us and finally gently took her hand. It was cold as ice. The DNA test was a terrible, painful thing, I said, my voice a hoarse whisper. But it was an act of love, Lena. It was the only weapon she had left to cut you free from a man who saw you as a business transaction. She chose to break your heart for a moment to save your soul for a lifetime. She looked at our joined hands and then back at her husband's ring still glittering on the table, and I saw the war in her eyes, the 20 years of her life, of her marriage, battling against the terrible clarifying truth of the last hour. What am I supposed to do now? She whispered, her voice that of a lost child. Who am I, if I am not Lena Vance? You are Lena Vance. I said, my voice full of a certainty I prayed she would feel. You are the daughter of Simone Vance, a queen who fought a war for you from her deathbed. And you are the daughter of Elias Vance, the man who loves you more than life itself, the man who is sitting right here and who will never ever let you go. Her face crumpled, the last of her defenses finally giving way. She let out a sob, a sound of pure, unadulterated heartbreak, and she fell into my arms. I held my daughter, my beautiful, broken, and finally free daughter, and I just let her cry. The storm had passed. The wreckage was all around us. But here in the quiet heart of the ruin, two survivors were holding on to each other. And it was at long last the beginning of a new and honest peace. The door closed on Greg, and with it on a whole chapter of our lives. In the profound, heavy silence that followed, I was left with the wreckage. Not the wreckage of a company, but the wreckage of a heart, my daughter's heart. I held her as she wept, her body trembling with the aftershocks of a lifetime of truths and lies colliding. There were no easy words. There was no simple way to mend what had been so thoroughly broken. All I could offer was my presence, a father's quiet, steady anchor in the storm of her sorrow. In the days that followed, a fragile, uncertain quiet settled over our lives. Lena went through the painful public process of separating her life from Greg's. She moved out of the grand, empty house they had shared and into a small, simple apartment. She was adrift, a woman whose past had been rewritten and whose future was a terrifying blank page. I gave her space, knowing that this was a journey she had to begin on her own. I would call her just to hear her voice, and our conversations were brief, stilted things full of unspoken pain. The easy, familiar rhythm of our old relationship was gone, replaced by a cautious, awkward dance around the crater that had been blown in the center of our family. I retreated to my workshop, the only place where the world still made sense. The scent of cedar and sawdust was a comfort, the solid, honest feel of the wood beneath my hands a grounding force. I worked not on any grand project, but on small, simple things, letting the familiar motions of my craft quiet the turmoil in my mind. About a week after the meeting, she came to me. I was in the workshop planning a piece of cherry wood, the rhythmic rasp of the blade, a soothing sound in the quiet afternoon. She appeared in the open doorway, a silhouette against the bright afternoon sun. She was no longer the polished, confident CEO's wife. She looked small, fragile, lost. She just stood there for a long time watching me work, and I just kept working, the steady motion of the plane, a quiet, welcoming rhythm. Finally, she stepped inside, her footsteps hesitant on the concrete floor. I never really understood what you did in here, she said, her voice a soft, quiet thing. I build things, I said, simply, not stopping my work. I try to make them strong. I try to make them true. She walked deeper into the room, running a hand over a stack of raw lumber, her fingers tracing the rough, unfinished grain. My whole life, she began, her voice a whisper. I thought I was a part of something strong and true. The Vance family, our company, our name. She looked at me, her eyes a universe of pain. And it was all a lie. The love was never a lie. Lena, I said, finally stopping my work and turning to face her. That was the only truth that ever mattered. The love your mother had for you, the love I have for you, that has never been a lie. But you're not my father, she said, the words a simple, heartbreaking statement of her own confusion. Am I not? I asked, gently. Was it not my hand you held when you were learning to walk? Was it not my arms that held you after you fell from your bicycle? Was it not my shoulder you cried on when your heart was first broken? Blood is an accident of birth, child. A family is something you build with your hands, with your heart, with your time. For 50 years, you and I and your mother, we have been building a family. That is not a lie. That is the truest thing in our lives. She began to cry again, but these were different tears. They were not the tears of a woman whose world had been destroyed, but the tears of a woman who was beginning to see the foundations that had remained standing all along. She started coming to the workshop every day. At first, she would just sit on a stool in the corner, watching me, a silent observer in a world she had never known. I would work, and she would watch, and in the quiet, shared space, something began to heal. The silence between us was no longer awkward. It was comfortable. It was the silence of two people who did not need words to understand each other's sorrow. Slowly, the questions began. They were quiet, tentative questions. She asked about her birth mother, Eleanor. Not with pain, but with a gentle, healing curiosity. I told her stories. I told her about Eleanor's laugh, which was as loud and joyful as a thunderstorm. I told her about her love for bad poetry and good music. I told her about the fierce loyalty she had shared with Simone. I was not just giving her facts. I was giving her a history, a piece of her own story that had been missing. I was giving her back her mother. And she, in turn, began to talk about Greg, about the life she had lived. I was so blind, she said one afternoon, her voice full of a quiet shame. I saw the way he was, the ambition, the way he dismissed your work as a hobby, the way he talked about Mom's traditions as obstacles. I saw it all, and I let it happen. I stood by, and I let it happen. Why did I do that, Daddy? The word Daddy was a quiet, beautiful miracle. Because you loved him, I said, my voice gentle. And love can make you blind. It can make you deaf to the things you don't want to hear. I was blind too, Lena, for a very long time. It took your mother's final, most painful act of love to make me see the truth. A new understanding began to form between us, an understanding forged not in a shared past of happy, simple truths, but in the shared, painful complexity of our new reality. It was a relationship that was deeper, more honest than what we had had before. One day I was sanding a finished piece of the project I was working on, a project to honor Simone. Lena, who had been watching me for an hour, quietly got up from her stool. She came over, picked up a piece of fine grit sandpaper and a block of wood. She didn't ask. She just started sanding the piece opposite me, her movements at first clumsy, then more sure, following my rhythm. We worked in silence for a long time, the two of us side by side. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic shushing of the sandpaper against the wood. In that moment, she was not the CEO's wife. She was not a victim of a terrible secret. She was just a woman working beside a man she called her father. She had stepped out of Greg's world of ambition and acquisition, and she had taken her first tentative step into mine. A world of creation, a world of healing. We were not just finishing a piece of furniture. We were rebuilding a family, one slow, patient, and honest motion at a time. The weeks that followed were a time of profound and quiet adjustment. The storm had passed, leaving behind a strange and altered landscape. The company, my company, was now firmly and unequivocally back in my hands. The name on the door was the same, but the heart within it had been through a terrible, necessary surgery. Lena, my daughter, had begun her own long, painful journey of healing, a journey I could only support from a distance, with a father's quiet, patient love. And I, Elias Vance, a man who had been a ghost in his own life for 5 years, was a king who had returned to a kingdom he was no longer sure he wanted to rule. The boardroom, the spreadsheets, the endless meetings about profit margins and supply chains, that was Greg's world. A world of noise and numbers. It was not mine. My world had always been a quieter place, a place that smelled of cedar and sawdust, a place where truth was found not in a balance sheet, but in the straightness of a line and the perfection of a joint. And so after ensuring Mr. Franklin had the business affairs under control, I returned to the only place I had ever truly felt at home. I went back to my workshop. It was a place I had neglected, a place I had abandoned. During Greg's reign, I had lost my fire. His constant talk of outsourcing and mass production, his dismissal of my craft as a hobby, had been a slow-acting poison that had seeped into my soul. The joy of creation had been replaced by a weary sense of obsolescence. The workshop had become a museum of the man I used to be, its tools lying dormant under a fine layer of dust, its air thick with the silence of forgotten things. I stood in the doorway for a long time, the afternoon sun slanting through the dusty windows, illuminating a million dancing motes in the air. The silence in here was different from the silence in the house. It was not the silence of loss. It was the silence of dormant potential, the quiet of a seed sleeping in the earth waiting for the rain. I walked to my old workbench, a massive slab of maple worn smooth by 50 years of labor. I ran my hand over its surface, my fingers tracing the scars and stains, each one a memory, a story. This was the geography of my life. I picked up an old hand plane, its steel a dull gray, its wooden handle dark with the patina of my own sweat and toil. I held it in my hands, its familiar comforting weight, a connection to the man I had been, the builder, the craftsman. And in that moment I felt a flicker, a tiny fragile spark in the cold gray ash of my creative spirit. I spent the rest of the day just cleaning. I wiped the dust from my tools. I sharpened the blades of my planes and chisels, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a meditative healing sound. I oiled the heavy cast iron machinery that had sat silent for too long. I was not just cleaning a room, I was performing a ritual. I was waking a sleeping giant. I was calling my own soul back home. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the workshop floor, I knew what I had to do. I knew what my first project had to be. It would not be for a client, it would not be for the company, it would be for her, for Simone. I went to the back of the workshop to a special rack of lumber I had been saving for years wood that was too precious, too full of character for any ordinary commission, and I found the piece I was looking for. A single magnificent 8-foot slab of curly cherry, its grain a wild shimmering river of reds and golds. I had been saving it for a masterpiece. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that its time had come. I would build a writing desk, a small, elegant lady's desk in the Queen Anne style she had always loved. It was a design she had sketched out for me years ago on a napkin during a long, lazy Sunday breakfast. A dream of a piece we had always talked about building together but had never found the time for. The next morning I began. I stood before the new clean workbench, the slab of cherry resting on it, and I felt that old familiar feeling, a nervous, excited spark of creative energy. The ghost of the man I had been was stirring, waking from a long and troubled sleep. I took a deep breath, the sweet, almond-like scent of the raw cherry wood filling my lungs, and I made the first cut. The sound of the saw, a high, clean scream, was a shock in the quiet morning. It was the sound of my new life beginning. As the blade bit into the wood, I felt the long, frozen winter of my grief and my anger begin to thaw. I was not just cutting wood, I was cutting a line between the past and the future. I was severing the final ties to the man who had sat in silence, a king in exile in his own company. And I was giving birth to the man who would now once again build. The work was slow, methodical, and deeply satisfying. It was a conversation between me and the wood, a language my hands knew better than my mind. As I worked, as I shaped the delicate cabriolet legs of the desk, memories of Simone came not as the sharp stabbing pains of fresh grief, but as warm, gentle whispers. I remembered her bringing me a cup of coffee in this very workshop, her quiet, supportive presence, a constant source of my strength. I remembered the look of awe on her face when I would finish a piece, her genuine appreciation for the beauty I had coaxed from the wood. I thought of the craft itself, the lessons it had taught me. Lessons I was only now beginning to truly relearn. The lesson of patience, the lesson of integrity, the lesson that a thing of true beauty and strength cannot be rushed, cannot be faked. It must be built slowly, honestly, with a deep and abiding respect for the materials at hand. It was the antithesis of everything Greg had stood for. His was a world of shortcuts, of leveraging, of finding the quickest path to the most profitable outcome. Mine was a world of slow, deliberate creation, and in the quiet, focused joy of my work, I knew with an absolute certainty which world was real and which was a hollow, pathetic illusion. The craftsman, the builder, the man I had been my entire life was not dead. He had only been sleeping. And now, here in the quiet sanctuary of his workshop, he was finally and fully awake. The weeks that followed were a time of profound and quiet adjustment. The storm had passed, leaving behind a strange and altered landscape. The company, my company, was now firmly and unequivocally back in my hands. The name on the door was the same, but the heart within it had been through a terrible necessary surgery. Lena, my daughter, had begun her own long, painful journey of healing. A journey I could only support from a distance with a father's quiet, patient love. And I, Elias Vance, a man who had been a ghost in his own life for 5 years, was a king who had returned to a kingdom he was no longer sure he wanted to rule. The boardroom, the spreadsheets, the endless meetings about profit margins and supply chains, that was Greg's world. A world of noise and numbers. It was not mine. My world had always been a quieter place, a place that smelled of cedar and sawdust, a place where truth was found not in a balance sheet but in the straightness of a line and the perfection of a joint. And so after ensuring Mr. Franklin had the business affairs under control, I returned to the only place I had ever truly felt at home. I went back to my workshop. It was a place I had neglected, a place I had abandoned. During Greg's reign, I had lost my fire. His constant talk of outsourcing and mass production, his dismissal of my craft as a hobby, had been a slow-acting poison that had seeped into my soul. The joy of creation had been replaced by a weary sense of obsolescence. The workshop had become a museum of the man I used to be, its tools lying dormant under a fine layer of dust, its air thick with the silence of forgotten things. I stood in the doorway for a long time, the afternoon sun slanting through the dusty windows, illuminating a million dancing motes in the air. The silence in here was different from the silence in the house. It was not the silence of loss. It was the silence of dormant potential, the quiet of a seed sleeping in the earth waiting for the rain. I walked to my old workbench, a massive slab of maple worn smooth by 50 years of labor. I ran my hand over its surface, my fingers tracing the scars and stains, each one a memory, a story. This was the geography of my life. I picked up an old hand plane, its steel, a dull gray, its wooden handle dark with the patina of my own sweat and toil. I held it in my hands, its familiar, comforting weight, a connection to the man I had been, the builder, the craftsman. And in that moment I felt a flicker, a tiny, fragile spark in the cold gray ash of my creative spirit. I spent the rest of the day just cleaning. I wiped the dust from my tools. I sharpened the blades of my planes and chisels, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a meditative healing sound. I oiled the heavy cast iron machinery that had sat silent for too long. I was not just cleaning a room. I was performing a ritual. I was waking a sleeping giant. I was calling my own soul back home. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the workshop floor, I knew what I had to do. I knew what my first project had to be. It would not be for a client. It would not be for the company. It would be for her. For Simone. I went to the back of the workshop, to a special rack of lumber I had been saving for years, wood that was too precious, too full of character for any ordinary commission. And I found the piece I was looking for. A single, magnificent 8-foot slab of curly cherry, its grain a wild, shimmering river of reds and golds. I had been saving it for a masterpiece. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that its time had come. I would build a writing desk, a small, elegant lady's desk in the Queen Anne style she had always loved. It was a design she had sketched out for me years ago on a napkin during a long, lazy Sunday breakfast. A dream of a piece we had always talked about building together but had never found the time for. The next morning I began. I stood before the new clean workbench, the slab of cherry resting on it, and I felt that old familiar feeling, a nervous, excited spark of creative energy. The ghost of the man I had been was stirring, waking from a long and troubled sleep. I took a deep breath, the sweet, almond-like scent of the raw cherry wood filling my lungs, and I made the first cut. The sound of the saw, a high, clean scream, was a shock in the quiet morning. It was the sound of my new life beginning. As the blade bit into the wood, I felt the long, frozen winter of my grief and my anger begin to thaw. I was not just cutting wood. I was cutting a line between the past and the future. I was severing the final ties to the man who had sat in silence, a king in exile in his own company, and I was giving birth to the man who would now once again build. The work was slow, methodical, and deeply satisfying. It was a conversation between me and the wood, a language my hands knew better than my mind. As I worked, as I shaped the delicate cabriolet legs of the desk, memories of Simone came not as the sharp, stabbing pains of fresh grief, but as warm, gentle whispers. I remembered her bringing me a cup of coffee in this very workshop, her quiet, supportive presence, a constant source of my strength. I remembered the look of awe on her face when I would finish a piece, her genuine appreciation for the beauty I had coaxed from the wood. I thought of the craft itself, the lessons it had taught me, lessons I was only now beginning to truly relearn. The lesson of patience, the lesson of integrity. The lesson that a thing of true beauty and strength cannot be rushed, cannot be faked. It must be built slowly, honestly, with a deep and abiding respect for the materials at hand. It was the antithesis of everything Greg had stood for. His was a world of shortcuts, of leveraging, of finding the quickest path to the most profitable outcome. Mine was a world of slow, deliberate creation. And in the quiet, focused joy of my work, I knew with an absolute certainty which world was real and which was a hollow, pathetic illusion. The craftsman, the builder, the man I had been my entire life, was not dead. He had only been sleeping. And now, here in the quiet sanctuary of his workshop, he was finally and fully awake. The door closed on Greg, and with it on a whole chapter of our lives. In the profound, heavy silence that followed, I was left with the wreckage. Not the wreckage of a company, but the wreckage of a heart. My daughter's heart. I held her as she wept, her body trembling with the aftershocks of a lifetime of truths and lies colliding. There were no easy words. There was no simple way to mend what had been so thoroughly broken. All I could offer was my presence, a father's quiet, steady anchor in the storm of her sorrow. In the days that followed, a fragile, uncertain quiet settled over our lives. Lena went through the painful public process of separating her life from Greg's. She moved out of the grand, empty house they had shared and into a small, simple apartment. She was adrift, a woman whose past had been rewritten and whose future was a terrifying blank page. I gave her space, knowing that this was a journey she had to begin on her own. I would call her just to hear her voice, and our conversations were brief, stilted things full of unspoken pain. The easy, familiar rhythm of our old relationship was gone, replaced by a cautious, awkward dance around the crater that had been blown in the center of our family. I retreated to my workshop, the only place where the world still made sense. The scent of cedar and sawdust was a comfort, the solid, honest feel of the wood beneath my hands, a grounding force. I worked not on any grand project, but on small, simple things, letting the familiar motions of my craft quiet the turmoil in my mind. About a week after the meeting, she came to me. I was in the workshop planning a piece of cherry wood, the rhythmic rasp of the blade a soothing sound in the quiet afternoon. She appeared in the open doorway, a silhouette against the bright afternoon sun. She was no longer the polished, confident CEO's wife. She looked small, fragile, lost. She just stood there for a long time watching me work, and I just kept working, the steady motion of the plane, a quiet, welcoming rhythm. Finally, she stepped inside, her footsteps, hesitant on the concrete floor. "I never really understood what you did in here," she said, her voice a soft, quiet thing. "I build things," I said simply, not stopping my work. "I try to make them strong. I try to make them true." She walked deeper into the room, running a hand over a stack of raw lumber, her fingers tracing the rough, unfinished grain. "My whole life," she began, her voice a whisper, "I thought I was a part of something strong and true. The Vance family, our company, our name." She looked at me, her eyes a universe of pain. "And it was all a lie. The love was never a lie, Lena," I said, finally stopping my work and turning to face her. "That was the only truth that ever mattered. The love your mother had for you, the love I have for you, that has never been a lie." "But you're not my father," she said, the words a simple, heartbreaking statement of her own confusion. "Am I not?" I asked gently. "Was it not my hand you held when you were learning to walk? Was it not my arms that held you after you fell from your bicycle?" Was it not my shoulder you cried on when your heart was first broken? Blood is an accident of birth, child. A family is something you build. With your hands, with your heart, with your time. For 50 years, you and I and your mother, we have been building a family. That is not a lie. That is the truest thing in our lives. She began to cry again, but these were different tears. They were not the tears of a woman whose world had been destroyed, but the tears of a woman who was beginning to see the foundations that had remained standing all along. She started coming to the workshop every day. At first, she would just sit on a stool in the corner watching me, a silent observer in a world she had never known. I would work and she would watch, and in the quiet shared space, something began to heal. The silence between us was no longer awkward. It was comfortable. It was the silence of two people who did not need words to understand each other's sorrow. Slowly, the questions began. They were quiet, tentative questions. She asked about her birth mother, Eleanor. Not with pain, but with a gentle, healing curiosity. I told her stories. I told her about Eleanor's laugh, which was as loud and joyful as a thunderstorm. I told her about her love for bad poetry and good music. I told her about the fierce loyalty she had shared with Simone. I was not just giving her facts. I was giving her a history, a piece of her own story that had been missing. I was giving her back her mother. And she in turn began to talk about Greg, about the life she had lived. I was so blind, she said one afternoon, her voice full of a quiet shame. I saw the way he was, the ambition, the way he dismissed your work as a hobby, the way he talked about mom's traditions as obstacles. I saw it all, and I let it happen. I stood by, and I let it happen. Why did I do that, Daddy? The word Daddy was a quiet, beautiful miracle. Because you loved him, I said, my voice gentle. And love can make you blind. It can make you deaf to the things you don't want to hear. I was blind too, Lena, for a very long time. It took your mother's final, most painful act of love to make me see the truth. A new understanding began to form between us, an understanding forged not in a shared past of happy, simple truths, but in the shared, painful complexity of our new reality. It was a relationship that was deeper, more honest than what we had had before. One day I was sanding a finished piece of the project. I was working on a project to honor Simone. Lena, who had been watching me for an hour, quietly got up from her stool. She came over, picked up a piece of fine grit sandpaper and a block of wood. She didn't ask. She just started sanding the piece opposite me, her movements at first clumsy, then more sure, following my rhythm. We worked in silence for a long time, the two of us side by side. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic shushing of the sandpaper against the wood. In that moment, she was not the CEO's wife. She was not a victim of a terrible secret. She was just a woman working beside a man she called her father. She had stepped out of Greg's world of ambition and acquisition, and she had taken her first tentative step into mine. A world of creation. A world of healing. We were not just finishing a piece of furniture. We were rebuilding a family, one slow, patient, and honest motion at a time. The seasons turned, and the quiet rhythm of my new life became a familiar, comforting melody. The days in the workshop were a blur of focused, honest labor. The writing desk I was building for Simone, the project I had started as an act of grief, had slowly become an act of joy. Each carefully cut joint, each smoothly sanded curve was a conversation with her, a way of honoring her memory, not with tears but with the craft that had defined my life. Lena was my constant companion in this new world. She would spend her afternoons with me in the workshop, her initial quiet observations slowly giving way to a tentative curiosity and then to a genuine passion for the work. I was not just getting my daughter back. I was watching her be reborn, watching her find a new sense of self in the scent of the wood and the simple, honest satisfaction of creating something with her own two hands. Today was the day I finished it. I had spent the morning applying the final lustrous coat of hand-rubbed oil, watching the grain of the curly cherry wood come alive, its deep shimmering river of reds and golds glowing with a life of their own. It was a beautiful thing, strong and elegant, a testament to the idea that with patience and care something wonderful could be built from raw, unfinished material. I stepped back from the workbench, wiping the sweat from my brow, and I looked at what my hands had made. The desk was done. My work was done. And my healing, I realized, was finally complete. Later that evening, I sat on the porch, a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, and I looked out at the lake as the sun set, painting the water in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. The house was quiet. Lena had gone back to her own apartment for the night. I was alone with my thoughts, and for the first time the past did not feel like a heavy ghost. It felt like a story that had finally found its ending. I thought of what had happened, of the brilliant, terrible, and beautiful plan my wife had set in motion. People, I supposed, might call what Simone did an act of revenge. They would see the ruin of Greg's life, the collapse of his company, the loss of his wife and his fortune, and they would see it as a cold, calculated act of vengeance from beyond the grave. But they would be wrong. I am a builder. I understand the nature of things. And what Simone designed was not an act of destruction. Revenge is a sledgehammer. It is a hot, angry, and satisfyingly destructive tool. It is for tearing down, for smashing, for reducing something to splinters in a moment of gratifying rage. It feels good for a moment, but it leaves behind nothing but a pile of rubble and a lingering bitter dust in the air. If this had been revenge, Simone would have simply exposed Greg's affairs, ruined his reputation, and let him fester in his own deceit. That would have been destruction. What my wife designed was not a sledgehammer. It was a set of finely calibrated chisels, a master craftsman's toolkit. Her plan was an act of justice, yes, but it was more than that. It was an act of liberation. It was not about causing pain. It was about ending a lie. It was a painful but necessary surgery designed to cut away the cancerous growth that was slowly killing our family, so that the healthy parts might have a chance to survive. Her plan had liberated me. It had freed me from a future I had been dreading, a future of being a silent, unhappy figurehead in a company I no longer recognized. A future of watching my life's work be corrupted and commercialized. It had freed me from a slow, lingering retirement of irrelevance. She had not just given me a fortune, she had given me back my purpose. Her plan had liberated my company. It had freed the soul of Vance Designs from the prison of Greg's ambition. He had seen it as a brand to be leveraged, a name to be sold. Simone, with her final act, had ensured that it would remain what we had always intended it to be, a legacy of quality, a testament to the simple, honest beauty of a well-made thing. And most importantly, her plan had liberated Lena. This was the heart of it all. This was the part that had cost her the most, the part that had required the most terrible, loving courage. She had to break her own daughter's heart, to demolish the life her daughter thought she had, in order to set her free. She had to show Lena the truth of the man she had married, the truth of the transactional world she had been living in. The DNA test was not a weapon of revenge against Greg. It was a key, a terrible, painful key designed to unlock the door of Lena's cage. And it had worked. The woman who now spent her afternoons in my workshop, her hands covered in sawdust, a quiet, genuine smile on her face, was a woman who was finally and for the first time free. Even Greg, in a strange and tragic way, had been liberated. He had been freed from the unsustainable prison of his own lies, from the frantic, desperate race to stay one step ahead of the debts and the failures. Simone's plan had not destroyed him. It had simply held up a mirror to him, and he had been destroyed by his own reflection. It was a harsh and terrible justice, but it was justice nonetheless. I looked at the house behind me, at the warm light glowing in the windows. I thought of the desk inside the last beautiful conversation I would ever have with my wife, and I understood. Simone's final act was not an ending. It was a beginning. It was a painful, necessary, and ultimately loving act of creation. She had not been a vengeful ghost. She had been a master builder right to the very end. And the peace I now felt, a peace as deep and as calm as the lake before me, was the final beautiful structure she had built for us all. A full year has passed since the day in the boardroom, a year of quiet healing and slow, deliberate rebuilding. The storm is over. Greg is a ghost from another life, a cautionary tale about a man who valued ownership over everything and ended up with nothing. Lena, my daughter, is free. Our relationship, which was fractured by a lifetime of secrets and a moment of terrible truth, is now stronger and more honest than it has ever been. And I, in the quiet sanctuary of my workshop, have found my way back to the man I was always meant to be, a builder. I am sitting here tonight, the scent of fresh-cut cherry wood hanging in the cool night air, this old leather-bound journal open before me. I have been writing this story down not as a record of events, but as an attempt to understand the profound and painful lesson that lies at the heart of it all. It is a lesson about a simple, powerful word, a word I thought I had understood for 75 years. Family. For most of my life, I believed family was a simple, straightforward thing, as strong and predictable as a well-made joint. It was a matter of blood, a father, a mother, a child, a clean, unbroken line stretching from one generation to the next. Your legacy was your name, and your children were the vessels who would carry it. Greg believed in this definition. In fact, he worshipped it. His entire world, his entire 20-year plan was built on the foundation of his wife's birthright. He saw her name Vance not as a part of her identity, but as a legal claim, a title deed to the company I had built. His obsession with blood was the engine of his greed, and in the end, it was the beautiful, terrible irony of my wife's plan that the one thing he worshipped, the scientific certainty of a bloodline, was the very weapon that destroyed him. The DNA test proved that his claim by his own narrow, materialistic definition was worthless. But the test also raised a deeper, more profound question. If Lena was not my daughter by blood, then who was she and who was I to her? For 50 years I had loved her as a father. I had taught her to read. I had held her when she cried. I had walked her down the aisle. That love, I know now, was the truest and most real thing in my life. The later revelation of a scientific fact could not erase the truth of a lifetime of lived experience. It could not undo a single bedtime story, a single bandaged knee, a single moment of fatherly pride. Her biological father was a man who gave her his blood and then abandoned her. He was a father in genetics, only a stranger. I was a stranger who by an act of love became her father. And in the quiet of this new life, I have come to understand the lesson that Simone in her wisdom was trying to teach us all. Family is not an accident of birth. It is not a matter of genetics. It is a choice. It is a promise. It is a structure you build day by day with your own two hands, with the strong, honest, and time-tested joinery of love, of loyalty, and of unwavering commitment. I am Lena's father not because she shares my blood, but because I chose 50 years ago to give her my heart. And that is a bond that no laboratory test can ever break. Simone was the true architect of our family. She was the one who, in her deepest grief for her lost friend, chose to build a new life for a tiny orphaned girl. She chose to build a family on a foundation of pure, unconditional love. And when she saw that family threatened by the corrosive, transactional worldview of her son-in-law, she acted to protect it. Her final brilliant plan was not just about saving a business from a greedy man. It was about saving the very definition of family that she and I had built together. She did not just save my legacy of craft. She saved our legacy of love. I look up from this journal and out the open door of my workshop. The light is on in the main house, a warm golden square against the deep blue of the evening. Lena is there. She has her own apartment in the city, but she spends most of her time here now with me. She is learning the craft, her hands once soft and manicured, now learning the language of the wood. She is not my heir in the way Greg would have understood it. She is the steward of a different kind of inheritance, an inheritance of principle. I see now that the painful truth of that day in the boardroom did not destroy our family. It purified it. It burned away the lies, the false assumptions, the transactional relationships, and it left behind only the essential, unbreakable core. A father and a daughter bound not by the simple accident of biology, but by the profound and powerful choice of love. And that I have learned is the only foundation that will ever truly last. I have been thinking a great deal about that word legacy. For most of my life, I thought I knew what it meant. It was a simple, straightforward concept like a blueprint for a sturdy house. You work hard. You build something tangible with your own two hands, a home, a business, a company with your name on the door. You raise your children, you teach them your values, and then at the end of your days, you pass it all down to them. The line is clean, direct, and unbroken. Your legacy is the material proof of your life's work carried on by your own flesh and blood. By that old definition, my life was a catastrophic failure. The company I built, the physical symbol of my life's work, was nearly corrupted beyond recognition. The son-in-law I had trusted to be its steward saw it only as a brand to be sold. The daughter I had raised, the one who was meant to carry my name and my values into the future, had stood by silently as it was all being dismantled. For a time in the raw early days after the confrontation, This thought was a source of profound, bottomless shame. I had failed. The structure I had spent a lifetime building had collapsed into a pile of rubble. But in the quiet of this new life, this life that was Simone's final brilliant gift to me, I have come to understand that I was looking at the wrong blueprint all along. It was my wife and this painful, necessary journey that taught me the true meaning of a legacy. A legacy is not what you own, it is what you create. Greg never understood that. He was a man obsessed with ownership. He wanted to own the title of CEO. He wanted to own the brand name. He wanted to own the market share. He saw the company as a collection of assets to be possessed, a thing to be leveraged for profit. He never once understood the soul of it, the quiet, patient, creative spirit that had given it life in the first place. He was a manager of things, not a maker of them. And because he never created anything of real value, when the ownership was stripped away, he was left with nothing. My legacy, I see now, was never the company itself. It was not the name Vance Designs on a sign. My legacy was the act of creation. It was the skill in my hands, the knowledge in my mind passed down from my own father, the unwavering commitment to quality and integrity that I poured into every piece of wood I ever touched. It wasn't the finished chair that was my legacy. It was the craft that went into making it. It was the love of the work. And Simone, my brilliant Simone, her true legacy was not the money she left in a trust. That was just the tool she used. Her true legacy was the plan itself, a magnificent, intricate, and deeply loving act of intellectual and emotional creation. Faced with the end of her own life, faced with the pain of our family's betrayal, she did not despair. She designed. She built. She created a fortress of justice and a blueprint for a new life for me and for Lena. Her legacy was her final beautiful and devastatingly effective design. I look around my workshop now. The writing desk I made for her sits in the main house, a silent, beautiful testament to our love. And in the center of the room, my daughter Lena stands at a workbench, her brow furrowed in concentration as she carefully learns to cut a dovetail joint. She is not a CEO. She is not a manager. She is a builder, a creator. She is learning the language of the wood. She is learning the patience of the craft. She is learning that true value is not something you can buy, but something you must make. I am not teaching her how to run a company. I am teaching her how to create something of beauty and permanence with her own two hands. I am not passing down an inheritance of money. I am passing down an inheritance of principle. This, I realize, is my true legacy. It is not the company that bears my name. It is the skill I am passing to my daughter. It is the joy of creation I see dawning in her eyes. It is the continuation of the craft of the love of the work. Greg tried to take what I owned, but he could never touch what I create, and that has made all the difference. I am sitting here tonight in my workshop, the scent of fresh-cut cherry wood hanging in the cool night air, this old leather-bound journal open before me. I have been writing this story down not as an indictment, not to create a record of blame, but to understand the profound and painful lesson that lies at the heart of it all. It is a lesson about two simple, powerful words, family and legacy. For most of my life, I believed family was a simple matter of blood, a direct, unbroken line. Greg, my son-in-law, worshipped this idea. His entire life's ambition was built on his wife's birthright. In the end, it was the beautiful, terrible irony of my wife's plan that the one thing he valued most, the scientific certainty of a bloodline, was the very weapon that destroyed his claim. But that same weapon, that same piece of paper, forced me to confront a deeper truth. For 50 years, I loved Lena as a daughter. The later revelation of a scientific fact could not erase the truth of a lifetime of lived experience. Her biological father gave her his blood and then abandoned her. He was a stranger. I was a stranger who by an act of love became her father. And I have learned that family is not an accident of birth. It is a choice. It is a structure you build day by day with the strong, honest, and time-tested joinery of love, of loyalty, and of unwavering commitment. And legacy. Greg saw it as a brand to be owned, an asset to be leveraged. He never understood that my legacy was not the company, but the act of creation itself. It was the skill in my hands, the integrity in my heart. My wife's true legacy was not the money she left, but the brilliant creative plan she designed to protect what was good and true. Today, my real legacy is not the company that bears my name, but the craft I am passing to my daughter, a legacy not of money, but of principle. I learned that blood may create relatives, but only loyalty and love can forge a family. My wife taught me that a legacy is not a name on a company door, but the integrity of the work done within its walls. Greed builds its house on a foundation of secrets, but truth is the earthquake that will always bring it down. The greatest inheritance you can receive is not a fortune, but the clarity to see who truly belongs in your life. What do you believe makes a true family? I would be honored to read your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this. Thank you for listening.